Up next, the killer is hunting law enforcement.
He's murdered right outside the courthouse. I was just amazed and shocked.
Possible targets are on edge.
I felt like there was a vendetta against law enforcement as a whole.
This hit very close to home. That attack was very brazen.
But the killer's own arrogance creates the clue that exposes him.
We had our evidence. Just a profound sense of relief that we had our guy. It was kind of a mix of Christmas morning and the Texas Rangers winning the World Series.
Kaufman County, Texas is close to Dallas, yet retains many of the down-home qualities Texans still hold dear. But proximity to Dallas is not without its cost, and Kaufman City, the county seat, sees more than its fair share of crime.
It's kind of like Mayberry, but Mayberry with methamphetamine maybe and the Aryan Brotherhood. Just by being situated close to Dallas County, they get a lot of that big city crime slopping over their county borders.
On a January morning in 2013, it was business as usual around the Kaufman County Courthouse.
The time of day, this is the time when the courthouse really starts to come alive and the square itself comes alive.
For Mark Hasse, a well-respected prosecutor, it looked to be a regular day at work. As Mark made his way to the courthouse, a man came up to him and appeared to confront him. Len Bush, a prosecutor and a former police officer, saw all of this as she was parking her car.
Mark was walking toward the courthouse. As they got closer to each other, the person who was walking toward Mark shoved him.
Within seconds, this became much more than a shoving match. The man who'd approached Mark pulled out a pistol, pushed it into Mark's neck, and shot him 5 times. Mark crumpled to the sidewalk. The shooter, who Lenda couldn't identify, ran to a waiting car and was driven away from the scene. Lenda's police training kicked in, and she followed the getaway car.
There was not a license plate there, so I saw no number or anything.
Lenda tried to tail the car, getting as many details on the make and model as she could, and then rushed back to help her friend. Police arrived moments later.
Mark was still alone when I got there, and I started giving him CPR, and more importantly, I started telling him that we're here, we know what's happened, and help is on its way.
But it was too late. The courthouse community was a tight-knit group. Everyone was stunned by this murder.
It was horribly brazen. It was horrific. It was terrible.
The attack itself was in broad daylight, right off a busy town square. It was unprecedented.
The murder was seen by a lot of people, but eyewitness descriptions, as is common, vary wildly. However, in this case, the witnesses agreed on one thing.
The shooter was all dressed in black. Even his face seemed to be concealed in some way, like he had some type of a mask on, but they really couldn't describe it. They couldn't put it into words.
This had all the trappings of a professional hit. Someone had clearly targeted Mark Hasse, a prosecutor known for his scrupulous honesty. The assassination of a public prosecutor was a national news story.
Investigators tonight combing through leads in a desperate attempt to track down the killer who shot and killed Mark Hasse.
For Mark Hasse's co-workers, it was an unmitigated tragedy. The unmarried 57-year-old had put a lot of criminals behind bars.
He was known around the courthouse as kind of the little lawyer with the big voice and just very tenacious and kind of a prosecutor's prosecutor.
And it appeared that's what got him killed, which had his co-workers wondering if anyone else could be a target.
People were concerned, citizens were concerned, law enforcement were concerned. It was the not knowing who's doing this, not knowing who's possibly next, and not knowing why this is being done.
After the shocking murder of Mark Hasse, the point man on finding his killer was Mark's boss, District Attorney Mike McClellan.
We're going to find you. We're going to pull you out of whatever hole you're in, and we're going to bring you back and let the people of Kaufman County prosecute you to the fullest extent of the law.
Mike took Mark's death very personally. It was on Mike's watch. And especially since it was right outside of the courthouse, Mike felt like he should have been able to protect him, been there in some way.
Suspicion immediately fell on people Mark Hasse had put in jail.
He prosecuted a lot of organized crime individuals, heavy hitters, gang-related type cases. So he thought maybe it might have been retribution for one of them.
He tried a lot of high-level drug cases, a lot of very violent drug cases. A major focus was to look back at some of those old cases and see if anybody had paroled out or any of those guys that he had gotten so much time on still carried that level of vengeance that they would have him gunned down.
In line with the theory that this was a professional hit, there was only one piece of evidence at the crime scene: a single bullet, apparently a missed shot.
It was a kind of a unique type of ammunition, not one that you see a lot. It was a 38 plus P ammunition.
This ammunition is built to be more powerful than a standard .38 caliber. Perhaps another sign the shooter was a professional.
That bullet was fired from either a .38 Special or .357 Magnum caliber firearm with 5 lanes and grooves with a right hand or clockwise twist. Possible manufacturers of the firearm that could have fired that bullet included, but were not limited to, Ruger, Smith & Wesson, or Taurus.
Detectives pored over Mark Hasse's case files, looking for potential suspects. Then, 6 weeks after the murder, there was a nearly identical murder in Colorado.
We begin then with the breaking news in the murder of Colorado's prison chief.
The head of the state's Department of Corrections was gunned down on his front porch. 2 days later, a car linked to that murder was found in Texas. The driver, 28-year-old Evan Ebel, was a white supremacist with a history of violence. He promptly shot and wounded the deputy who pulled him over, and then led police on a miles-long car chase that only ended after he crashed into a truck and later died. This bizarre series of events had a possible direct connection to Mark Hasse. He had put a lot of members of the Aryan Brotherhood, a notoriously violent white supremacist gang, in jail.
So obviously getting into a shootout with law enforcement, somebody connected to the white prison gangs, we looked at him almost instantly as a potential suspect in this case.
A bullet recovered from this shootout with police was consistent with the caliber of bullet recovered from the Hasse murder. But this connection quickly fizzled out. Evan Ebel was not in Texas at the time Mark was shot.
It was a strange coincidence how all of this happened. Everything just kind of intersected at the same time. A lot of our county officials had protection. We didn't know who was watching, and I had 2 daughters that I wanted to make sure were safe.
9 days after the Evan Ebel shootout, a Dallas police officer paid a visit to the home of Kaufman County District Attorney Mike McClellan, an old family friend. And what that officer discovered brutally confirmed suspicions that someone was after local law enforcement.
This is a targeted event. It has to be. Somebody just doesn't come in your house and kill you in your own home for no reason.
Mike McClellan was the hard-charging district attorney of Kaufman County. His wife, Cynthia, was a nurse who loved her role as the DA's at-home right hand.
She definitely enjoyed kind of being the mom of the DA's office. She would bring in cookies, or if somebody was having a new housewarming or a new baby, she would make them a quilt. She loved hosting Christmas parties for everybody.
The McClellans, like everyone in Kaufman County law enforcement, were on guard after the execution-style murder of Mark Hasse, one of Mike McClellan's top prosecutors.
Everyone was definitely on edge. I mean, you had a first assist district attorney that was murdered right outside the courthouse. So I think it made everybody a little bit nervous as to what was going on and how they should proceed after this.
C.J. Tomlinson, a Dallas police officer, had close ties to the McClellan family. His parents had known them for years. In fact, He later married their daughter, Christina. On the Saturday before Easter, the McClellans weren't returning any calls.
I had received a phone call from my mother saying that she was going to go over to the house and check on him because she hadn't been able to get a hold of Mike or Cynthia all day. At that point, I didn't think a whole lot about it. I said, okay, go over there.
CJ's mother arrived to find the house locked with the lights on and the cars in the driveway. Concerned, she called her son. Soon, both CJ and his mother entered the home and found a scene of stunning violence.
Whoever did that was a monster. Whoever was capable of doing that, walking into someone's house and shooting two people and an innocent lady that had nothing to do with anything besides being married to the DA. You're a monster.
The McClellans, still dressed in their pajamas, had been shot repeatedly. Mike 16 times, Cynthia 8.
And it was just a savage, brutal crime scene that just kind of screamed overkill when you looked at the crime scene.
There was no forced entry. No one knew how the killer got into the house, but it was clear he had only one purpose.
If I had to describe it, it was almost like a hunt. It was very concentrated on them. There's no doubt that he went in there with the intent to kill whoever was in there.
There was no weapon at the scene, but analysts recovered 20 shell casings, which the shooter clearly didn't attempt to hide. These .223 caliber casings were consistent with bullets recovered at the McClellans' autopsies.
On the bullets, we were able to look at those microscopic patterns and determine that one single firearm had fired all of those bullets. So essentially, investigators were looking for one firearm that was used in that offense.
And that firearm was some sort of semi-automatic assault rifle. A piece of surveillance video from a nearby business raised a disturbing possibility that the killer might be a disgruntled member of local law enforcement.
There was this one video that was captured near the McClellans' home, and it was an unmarked white Crown Victoria that was similar to a police car. That raised a red flag for us.
Did Mike McClellan know his killer? Had he let a police officer into his home, not knowing he and his wife could be a target? No one had any answers, and Kaufman County had never seen anything like this before.
To have two prosecutors from the same office, along with one of their spouses, gunned down in such a short time frame, it just makes your head spin. I didn't have any context in which to put it. All I knew is I was scared.
24 hours after the McClellan murders came a possible break. Among the hundreds of tips that poured into the Crime Stoppers website was one that jumped out. This tipster claimed credit for the murders under a headline that read, "Do we have your full attention now?"
The tip actually named the ammunition type in the Hassey murder, which did get our attention because until now, it was only law enforcement who knew this. So it was either the shooter or law enforcement because we were the only ones who knew at the time.
The tipster threatened to commit more murders unless a local judge resigned that week. Despite the tip, frustrated detectives were no closer to identifying a suspect until they found out something that Mark Hassey and Mike McClellan had in common before they were murdered. 1 year earlier, they convicted local justice of the peace, 46-year-old Eric Williams, for theft of public property. His case appeared to be the only thing that tied the murders together. But theft of public property is a long way from cold-blooded murder.
It's a big stretch, for sure. Stealing computer monitors from the county IT to, capital murder. Yeah, it's a big stretch.
Just 6 months into Eric Williams' job as a local justice of the peace, he was caught on tape taking computers from his office. He said it was perfectly legal.
He compared the computer monitors with toilet paper. He thought it was okay to go to the room and get toilet paper for his bathrooms in his office, so he just went into the room and took what he wanted. I don't think that you actually believe, you're an educated person, I see your class rank fair, that you can just walk into ID department and say, I need a monitor, I'm taking that one. I mean, there's places that do that. Places being here in Coleman County, or I mean, there's businesses that do that. It depends on how they run all their departments.
Mike McClelland assigned his toughest prosecutor, Mark Hasse, to prosecute the case with him. Eric Williams was convicted and got probation, but the conviction ended his career.
And his life had been on an upward trajectory for quite some time. And then when he was convicted of these crimes by Mark and Mike, that was the first bad thing that had gone wrong in his life.
Was this the vendetta feared by local law enforcement? A criminal record and the possibility of revenge was enough for a search warrant. In Williams's house, on a piece of scrap paper, detectives found a game-changing clue: the password to the Crime Stoppers tip line.
Every time a tip is submitted online, it generates a unique password to that website. And Eric Williams, as the user of that tip, had a distinct individual password, and he wrote that down. One of the agents recognized that that was the password for the online tip we had been concerned about, so it was a good piece of detective work.
When word got out that Williams was a suspect, detectives got a call from a friend of his. He knew of a storage shed that might have a connection to the murders. Investigators descended on the facility, found a white Crown Victoria similar to the one caught on video leaving the crime scene. And that wasn't all.
There were plenty of weapons that looked like AR-type weapons or .38 caliber 357s.
That was an amazing moment. There's probably not words that would adequately express what it felt like when we saw that door go up.
Among all the firepower in the shed, the key piece of evidence appeared to be one unfired round, apparently left by accident.
Everything else, all the other thousands of rounds Eric Williams had in that storage unit, was meticulously put away and kept in place. He was a neat freak. But this one live round was found in the bottom of a tactical bag. And a fast-thinking FBI agent collected it, packaged it separately, and sent it to the lab.
This live round had apparently been in one of Williams's automatic rifles and then taken out without ever having been fired. But when the bullet was put in the gun and when it was ejected, tool marks were left on the soft metal of the bullet's shell casing.
I determined that that unfired cartridge had at one time been cycled in the same unknown firearm as all of the fired cartridge cases from the McClelland crime scene. Looking at those microscopic patterns, we determined that that unfired cartridge had in fact been loaded and then unloaded from the same firearm as the fired cartridge cases from the crime scene.
The ballistics was huge for us because it put Eric in the home of the McClellans.
There was one last question. Who drove Williams away from the Mark Hasse murder? Williams's wife, Kim, was questioned. When told of the mountain of evidence against her husband and that both of them faced possible execution, she immediately admitted she was in on the plot.
She told us that Eric's pain was her pain, his joy was my joy. So I think she was his biggest cheerleader. She felt wronged by Mark and Mike, and she wanted payback just as bad as Eric Williams did.
Kim Williams led police to a local lake where she claimed she and Eric disposed of evidence. Dive teams later found the mask Williams wore when he shot Mark Hasse. Also found were two guns, one of which was tied back to the Mark Hasse murder by ballistic analysts. Prosecutors say Eric Williams planned everything. At the McClelland home, he came in shooting, knowing his assault rifle would leave shell casings behind. What he apparently didn't know was that when he emptied the unused bullets from that gun after the murder and picked up those bullets, he missed one. And the bullet had microscopic tool marks that tied it back to the gun used to kill the McClellans. After the murders, Eric Williams and his wife celebrated with a steak dinner.
One thing to understand about Eric Williams, he's a psychopath that thinks he's smarter than everyone. Finally, his ego was his undoing.
And that ego was on full display when Williams drove his Segway to talk to reporters shortly after the murders.
My heartfelt condolences go out to both the McClellan family and the Hassey family, because they were in public office doing the right thing, and for some reason that we're not aware of, have paid the ultimate price for that.
In December of 2014, Eric Williams was convicted of capital murder and got the death penalty. Kim Williams pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and was sentenced to 40 years. The murder left their mark on the community and might not have been solved if not for the microscopic marks left on the single bullet that finally broke the case open.
This case would have been exponentially more difficult if we did not have the forensics. Even though we don't have the gun, we know the gun that was in Eric Williams' storage unit was the same gun that was at the McClellan crime scene. So that ballistic piece for us without that murder weapon was just absolutely a home run for us.
Up next, two women in love with the same man.
These two women want to spend time with the bad boy. I think he was a kind of a gigolo kind of guy.
One member of this love triangle is murdered.
They got to the point where they completely hated each other.
If someone's shot in the back of the head, that's an execution. Somebody wanted that person dead.
But even after an arrest, questions remain.
Everything inside of me had been sucked out. Hope is gone. Completely helpless.
Amarillo, the largest city in the Texas Panhandle, was once known as the helium capital of the world. It used to be one of the most helium-rich places on the planet.
At one point, helium was much more important in the manufacture of lots of things, including a lot of military devices and weapons. It doesn't play as crucial a role now as it once did.
On an April morning in 2014, local police were called to the outskirts of town, to Helium Road, the name harkening back to Amarillo's former role in helium production.
It's a dirt road, so a lot of people would still use it for a shortcut to get to where they're going.
A sheriff's officer found the body of a young woman lying next to an SUV. The victim suffered extensive trauma to the back of her head. She had no ID, no phone, no wallet. But investigators were able to trace her vehicle. It belonged to 32-year-old Robin Spielbauer.
They informed us, based on a couple of pictures that my wife had, that it in fact was Robin. So we were going through our mind of like, okay, what, who, why? All sorts of questions.
The crime scene provided only a few answers. Blood evidence showed Robin had been killed where she was found. Despite the massive blows to the back of her head, that wasn't what killed her.
It was during the autopsy that they discovered that she had actually been shot as well with a .22 caliber weapon.
The oddest clue at the scene was on one of the windows of Robin's vehicle.
There appeared to be slight damage to the window itself, like your windshield when a rock hits it and creates a little star break. There were 2 or 3 spots like that and a pink substance of some kind. And it looked to be associated with these small chips in the window.
Robin's murder stunned her family and friends.
Robin always had like this real here I am personality, you know, and you knew she was in the room when she was there and friendly with everybody.
Maybe not everybody. Robin, the mother of 2 young girls, had divorced the girls' father, J.D. Spielbauer, just 18 months earlier. J.D. and Robin began their romance nearly a decade before Robin's murder.
She was, I think, desperately in love with Mr. Spielbauer, and very desirous of spending the rest of her life with him and the two of them raising their children.
But J.D. strayed repeatedly from the marriage. After 7 years together, Robin finally called it quits and took the kids with her. J.D. denied any involvement in her murder, but even he couldn't deny his place as a prime suspect in his ex-wife's death.
The sheriff's department, they asked him, "Do you have any information that will be of help to us?" His response was, "No, I don't know anything. I'm of no help to you. I just have no information. I don't know anything."
When J.D. Spielbauer and his future wife Robin met in 2003, the relationship turned red hot almost immediately.
They spent all their time together and actually got pregnant within the first 4 to 5 weeks of them starting dating. So it sped everything up a lot faster.
Robin's parents were both ex-military. She grew up at times overseas as what some call a military brat. J.D. told her he'd done tours of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan. He seemed a solid bet as a responsible husband and father.
She was more like wanted something stable and, down home. She wanted a family and just the proverbial house with the picket fence.
After the wedding, J.D. began carrying on a couple of affairs while Robin raised their 2 young children.
She wanted what her parents had so bad that she thought she could find a way to make him happy to where he would stay.
But J.D. finally crossed a line that even Robin couldn't tolerate. He had an affair with a woman named Katie Phipps. Why was this worse than the others? Because Katie was someone Robin opened up to about the troubles in her marriage.
Robin knew Katie before J.D. did, and as is always the case with an affair and an unhappy marriage, it eventually resulted in divorce by 2014. And after that, J.D. had married Katie.
To make matters even worse, J.D. and his new wife, Katie, moved into a house very near where Robin was raising the children she'd had with J.D.
And the weird thing about it was 2 houses down from our house.
This was an inherently volatile situation, especially with young children being moved between both houses day after day.
Katie and Robin, there were a lot of hostility between the 2 women. They both cared about J.D., and J.D. had been involved with both, and it was a classic triangle.
Over the 2013 Thanksgiving holidays, the hostility between these 2 romantic rivals boiled over.
Robin walks into the house to go upstairs to get her girls, and Katie follows her in the house, grabs her by the hair, pulls her down off the stairs, onto the floor, got on top of her, where Robin in turn kicked her off and kicked her into the fireplace. I honestly told her, I said, she's the kind of crazy that'll kill you.
No charges were filed, but this did nothing to relieve the tension. In fact, both women were convinced that J.D. was sleeping with each of them behind their backs. Katie was livid about this and made no secret about it.
She was just hammering on J.D. every day in text messages. "I believe you're having an affair with Robin." J.D. would deny it, but Katie wasn't buying it. She was convinced that he was seeing Robin behind her back.
A search of Katie's cell phone showed that in the 4 days before Robin was killed, she sent more than 300 of these texts. That's an average of nearly 4 texts every hour on the hour, 24 hours a day.
There were text messages with Katie threatening Robin either directly or indirectly.
When you read Katie's text messages, she says that she can't do it anymore and she's going to finish it. Does that mean murder someone or simply divorce him? When you see a text message like that, it kind of points more toward her being guilty.
Now, 5 months after the Thanksgiving altercation, Robin Spielbauer was in a morgue with a fatal bullet wound. Katie, her romantic rival, clearly had a potential motive to kill her. But when brought in for questioning, her top priority wasn't the murder.
I'm going to ask you a question. Can you be honest with me?
Yeah, I will be.
Is my husband cheating on me with her?
I don't have proof of that. I've had several folks tell me that he was. I will tell you this right now. They were going to meet last night. Where they were supposed to meet at 9:30. Here's the problem.
Soon, Katie had even more things to be upset about. Detectives located the murder weapon. They also found this photograph of Katie holding what looked to be that very same gun.
When I first saw that picture, I was like, oh my gosh, she did it.
When Katie Phipps emerged as a possible suspect in the murder of Robin Spielbauer, police searched the home Katie shared with Robin's ex-husband, J.D.
During the search warrant, a .22 Sig Sauer Mosquito automatic pistol was recovered, along with several other firearms.
This .22 caliber pistol was a distinctive weapon. It had pink polymer plating, apparently a marketing device.
With the pink casing, you automatically assume that it's a woman's gun. Misogynistic? Yes, probably. But that was one of those things that immediately pops into your head.
The fact that it was pink, fantastic. Mine's purple. Is nothing out of the normal for, a lot of people around here in Texas.
Investigators now employed a rarely used but simple forensic technique called a physical fit. Like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, a shard of metal that chipped off the gun and was found at the crime scene fit perfectly with the gap left on the gun itself. And a test fire of the weapon confirmed what this evidence already showed.
It was Katie's gun. There were pictures all over Facebook of her shooting this strange pink gun.
So Katie owned the murder weapon, and she clearly had a motive.
What's Robin dead and why?
I don't know.
You've got a motive for her. You don't like her. Not much of a motive, but it's a motive. So that's why you get looked at. Y'all had conflicts in the past. Have you ever threatened to kill her?
No, I have not.
Because a couple of folks have said you had.
No, I have not threatened to kill Robin.
You conspire with anybody to kill Robin?
No, I did not conspire with anybody to kill Robin. No, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I liked her, because I didn't. But my father died when I was 2. I buried my mother when I was 18 years old. I know what it feels like to grow up without a parent. I would never do that to anybody. I'm not a murderer. I do a lot of things, but I'm not a murderer.
Katie actually requested a polygraph examination.
My lawyer told me, do not do this. You're going to fail it. They want you to fail it. They're going to tell you that you failed it, hoping that you're going to confess. Of course, I failed it, just like he told me I would.
Even worse, Katie did not have a rock-solid alibi for the night of the murder. She said she was at a friend's house close to Helium Road and never saw Robin that night. But she turned off her cell phone so it couldn't be used to track her.
I did not do this.
So you have nothing to offer
That's
us?
not true. I don't know. Ask me.
Who did it?
I don't know.
Who do you think did it?
I don't know. I'm starting to think maybe JD did.
Well, thank you for your time.
And as an ex-husband, J.D. had to be looked at as a possible suspect. A background check revealed that J.D.'s claims to be a war veteran were all lies.
I'd rather pissed, because that's to me, it's something you don't lie about. It just didn't sit well.
J.D. claimed he had no contact with his ex-wife Robin on the night she was murdered. But cell phone records exposed this as another lie.
In the text messages, they discovered that Robin was communicating with JD on the 7th several times and making reference to a meeting that was to take place with JD.
That meeting was set for the night Robin was killed. When confronted with this evidence, JD changed his story. He admitted meeting Robin at Helium Road and said someone unexpected showed up at that meeting.
Got any back seat with her. A few moments later, hear a tapping on the glass. Sound like a car key or something, a ring. Something harder than a fist. End up opening the door and I see Katie there, which took me by surprise. They're bickering back at each other. I'm trying to stop the bickering. I turn to Katie, I tell her, let's get in the car and let's go home. And I go walking back to my truck.
But according to JD, Katie didn't follow. He said the two women continued yelling at each other as he drove away. The next day, Robin was found dead. JD's story, or stories, were changing by the hour. But detectives, convinced Katie was the killer, thought there was a good reason.
We believe that J.D. Spielbauer was telling false stories, and the stories were changing because he was trying to protect his wife, Katie.
3 days after Robin's body was found, Katie was arrested and charged with capital murder.
And I look over, and there's my son getting out of my sister-in-law's car. And he watches them put me on the ground at gunpoint and handcuff me. And I remember just looking at my son like, I'm not gonna see you for a long time.
Katie Phipps maintained from the beginning that she had problems with Robin Spielbauer, but would never resort to murder. Detectives weren't buying it, and Katie remained behind bars for more than a year while they built their case.
I spent my 29th birthday in jail. I lost my kids to CPS. My ex-husband took all of my stuff except for the little bit of clothes he allowed my brothers to come pick up. I lost everything.
J.D. Spielbauer's cell phone put him at the scene of the murder. Since Katie's phone was off, it could not be used to track her. But then detectives found out about a relatively new way that they could possibly pinpoint her location at the time of the murder. Mark Sedgwick is a member of the FBI's Cellular Analysis Survey Team, or CAST.
What we do, our biggest thing is if there's a kidnapping, we will exploit any phone, social media type data that gives us any location to try and locate that missing child.
This method targets a cell phone's wireless capacity, or Wi-Fi, and can provide a nearly exact location. It doesn't rely on cell towers. It goes directly to your phone.
You get a lot more accurate readings. And then GPS is your GPS. It works off the satellites, your satellite signals that your phone's GPS antenna sees.
Since Katie's phone was off on the day of Robin's murder, this wasn't an option with her phone. But she was seen at numerous points during that day and night with her 11-year-old son, Diego, and the Wi-Fi on his phone was up and running the whole time. The targeting of that phone left no doubt. Katie was not at Helium Road when Robin Spielbauer was shot at about 9:50 that night.
We had 3 adult eyewitnesses who all agree Diego and Katie were together all day. She never left and left him there. She never went anywhere without Diego. Katie could never have killed Robin. She was never there. She was never at Helium Road that night.
Mr. Fearon said, today I'm dismissing your case. And I fell out of the chair and I hit the ground and I cried and I cried and I don't know how long I cried.
Following Katie's release, J.D. Spielbauer found himself facing a charge of capital murder. Prosecutors are convinced J.D. planned the murder. He lured Robin to Helium Road and had Katie's pink-plated .22 caliber in his truck. Robin had no idea what awaited her. In fact, she also wanted the meeting.
She was going to meet with J.D. and tell him no more booty calls. It's over. She told several other friends, I'm ending this affair with J.D. From now on, I only want to see him if it involves the girls, and I want all of my child support.
The couple, while in Robin's SUV, started fighting. JD apparently got out of the SUV, went back to his truck, and came back brandishing the pink-plated pistol. Robin hit automatic lock on all her car doors. JD pounded the gun on the rear window. Strike marks from the plastic handle and a piece of metal chipped off the gun were later matched back to Katie's gun. Ultimately, it appears Robin exited her SUV, apparently thinking JD would never actually shoot her. She was wrong. He fired once, hitting her, and attempted to fire again, but the gun jammed. It appears he walked back to his truck, came back with some type of tool, possibly a tire iron, and made sure Robin was dead. His attempt to frame Katie for Robin's murder almost worked. After all, the ballistics tied the shell casing back to Katie's pink pistol. But JD failed to realize cell phone evidence put him at the site of the murder and showed Katie was not there.
To quote Arthur Conan Doyle through the lips of Sherlock Holmes, when you've eliminated every other possibility, whatever's left is the truth.
In January of 2018, a jury found J.D. Spielbauer guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced him to life in prison. Katie, forever grateful for the cell phone technology that proved her innocence, is now using her experience on both sides of the law as a criminal paralegal near Dallas.
Cell phone records are the new DNA. It doesn't matter where you come from in life, how much money you make, you have a cell phone. And that cell phone is traceable. If it wasn't for today's technology and all the advances that we've made, I would surely be spending the rest of my life in prison.
Up next, an insurance agent's murder stuns suburban St. Louis.
It was a broad daylight execution. It was shocking.
This was a very brazen crime.
Years pass. No one's arrested. Until a suspect is identified by new technology.
It's a real game changer.
And the killer soon learns you can't hide what you can't see.
In this trial, I guarantee you he got an education.
Nestled along the west bank of the Missouri River, the St. Louis suburb of St. Charles looms large in U.S. history. It marks the spot where, in 1804, Lewis and Clark began their epic journey into the still uncharted American interior.
It was a stop for Lewis and Clark, so they're very proud of that. There's a statue of Lewis and Clark down by the riverfront.
On the morning of June 8, 2007, the peacefulness of this Midwestern community was shattered when a postal worker, doing her normal rounds, made a gruesome discovery. She found insurance agent Bob Eidman bloody and possibly dead in his office.
She saw the body and then ran out screaming, as I think any of us would.
Police arrived to find Bob Eidman dead at the scene. He'd been shot, execution style.
He was shot once in the face and once in the neck. The last shot, the shooter was standing over him, looking down at him, and fired one shot, went through and through his head and buried itself in the floor.
This was cold-blooded murder, but that didn't jibe with the rest of the crime scene, which was sloppy and haphazard, what detectives call a disorganized crime.
Bob Eidman's murder was not a particularly careful crime.
There were, on the floor of the office, spent cartridges and also live rounds, which said to us that the shooter either had a bad weapon or he wasn't a good shooter.
The murder weapon was later determined to be a 9mm pistol. It was not found at the scene. Other than bullets, apparently from that gun, there was no evidence of the shooter in Bob's office. For now, detectives were stumped.
It worried a lot of people because it was something that happened in broad daylight.
Detectives questioned everyone at the neighboring businesses. To their surprise, no one saw anything. But someone did hear something. A woman with an office directly below Bob's heard a series of pops, but thought nothing of it at the time.
She thinks, oh, Bob, what's Bob up to? What's he doing up there? Is he moving furniture? Did he drop something? So she yells up to him playfully, hey, keep it down, Bob. Not realizing that he's just been shot dead.
This helped detectives nail down a time for Bob's murder, shortly before 11 a.m. Detectives got another possible break from a Mexican grocery store at the other end of the strip mall.
They had a very good surveillance system because it was a warm day, their door was open, and one of the cameras actually had a view out into the parking lot, and we could see a white Ford Focus circle around shortly before 11 o'clock.
At 10:50 a.m., this white Ford Focus passes in front of the bodega going toward Bob's office. And at 10:54, it passes again, going the same direction. There's no reason to go down that alley once, let alone twice within 4 minutes.
The hunt was on for a white Ford Focus, which, in a setback, turned out to be an unusually popular vehicle.
Police found 1,300 cars of that description in the St. Louis area.
Even worse, Interstate 70, a major highway, was right next to the murder site. The killer had an easy escape route. And he wouldn't be the first to use it. In the 1990s, a serial killer, dubbed the I-70 killer, escaped via I-70 after all his murders.
The individual responsible for the I-70 killings would go into a business, contact usually the sole person in the business, and would shoot them in the head.
It was right off the highway, and so we thought it could be anyone. I mean, thousands of cars go by Interstate 70 every day.
All told, police say the I-70 killer murdered 6 people, and he hadn't been caught.
Is this a random killing of Bob Eidman the start of something more, the start of a larger pattern? Do we need to be afraid here?
Any business involves risk. Bob Eidman's was riskier than most. A lot of it was done on the spot, in cash.
He was dealing with people with high-risk insurance, people who were having trouble getting insurance other places, people who had suspended licenses or DWIs.
In the initial search, nothing appeared to be missing from Bob's office.
When the police got there, there was still cash inside that cash drawer that hadn't been taken.
We thought it was drugs or something that was more personal. You usually don't get murdered for no reason at all.
Detectives were hoping they might get some information from Bob's wife, Diane. The day of the murder, she had been unable to reach her husband and showed up at the strip mall where Bob worked. She arrived while the scene was being processed. Police broke the news to her.
There's no right way to react to the news that your spouse has been brutally murdered. It's a shock for any of us.
Though nothing appeared to be missing from Bob's office, his wife told police to check his back pocket.
She told them that he always kept a wallet with a lot of cash in it, several $100s usually.
Bob's wallet was gone. Police thought it was almost certain his killer had reached into his back pocket to get it. Evidence technicians swabbed the pocket. But they knew that in the absence of bodily fluids, DNA technology in 2007 couldn't produce a genetic profile from this piece of evidence.
I was very skeptical, in fact, of being able to get something from that pocket.
But DNA technology was getting more powerful every day. Analysts put the DNA from Bob's murder in storage, in the hope that science would catch up to their evidence. In the meantime, detectives turned back to Bob's wife, Diane.
When someone is randomly, brutally murdered, police automatically look at their spouse as a suspect as a matter of course.
Diane said Bob, despite being in the insurance business himself, had only a tiny life insurance policy, about $5,000.
That's when we found out that there were, in fact, 3 separate life insurance policies on Bob.
And they were worth a lot more than $5,000.
All 3 life insurance policies combined were $750,000. There was only one beneficiary involved, and that was Bob's wife, Diane Eidman.
Was it possible Diane didn't know how much insurance money she'd get if Bob died? Could she have lied to police about her knowledge of the payout? After all, $750,000 seemed like a good reason to want Bob dead.
It certainly looked like a motive to us.
Diane was alibied for the time of the murder, but that didn't get her off the hook.
Could she have had somebody do it? Sure. But if you're going to do that, you have to communicate with someone, because most people don't have a hitman in their Rolodex.
Detectives now turned to the Eidmans' phone records and computer activity. And when they did, the mystery of Bob Eidman's murder took a twist few people who knew him ever anticipated.
In searching Bob's computer use, we found that he was visiting a lot of gay pornography sites on the internet, and massage businesses, gay massage businesses, and that type of thing.
What detectives found on Bob's computer revealed a man with a secret life, a new lover, and someone with a possible motive for murder.
As it turned out, Bob Eidman had a secret lover in Kansas City and had for 8 months.
In the initial investigation into Bob Eidman's murder, police thought the only person with an apparent reason to kill him was his wife, Diane.
Diane Eidman is a prime suspect because she does have motive. She had means, she knew where things were kept in the office, and she was going to benefit with a great deal of insurance money.
And it appeared that she might have a motive beyond collecting a $750,000 insurance payment. A search of Bob's computer showed he'd been cheating on her. A few months earlier, he embarked on a sexual relationship with a man named Kurt.
He and Bob met in Columbia, Missouri, which is about halfway between St. Louis and Kansas City, on a number of weekends, and spent a weekend in a motel there.
Kurt was interviewed and was alibied for the time of the murder, which didn't necessarily eliminate him as a suspect. But he did have some possibly interesting information for detectives.
Some weeks before the murder, Bob had called him and said, Diane found out about us and we've got to stop seeing each other for a while.
During numerous interviews with detectives, Diane never said anything about Bob cheating on her.
Why would she not tell us this? It could be a motive for her to be responsible for killing Bob.
The fact that he was cheating on his wife with a man, all of that adds up to a lot of motive.
Diane was given a polygraph test. The results were inconclusive.
Does that mean she did it? No. If she failed, would that mean she did it? Not necessarily.
In searching all of Diane's communications in the weeks and months before her husband's murder, police could find no evidence of her hiring someone to kill Bob.
Show me that communication, show me that wire, and if you can't, it didn't happen.
I believe Diane Eidman was probably responsible for this homicide, but there was no concrete evidence enough to arrest her.
The case went cold. Outside of ballistic evidence from the scene, which was useless in the absence of a murder weapon, detectives had very little evidence. The surveillance video of a white Ford Focus circling the strip mall shortly before Bob was shot, which might or might not have something to do with the murder, and the back pocket of Bob's pants, which might or might not contain the killer's DNA. But DNA technology was moving along at an exponential pace, Touch DNA was revolutionizing crime science.
In the old days, with less sensitive testing, you would have had to have the defendant or perpetrator's blood or semen or saliva there, and they wouldn't have found it. Touch DNA isn't really so much a separate thing as it is a continuation of DNA.
Was it possible that the killer, simply by touching Bob's back pocket while stealing the wallet, had left a genetic signature behind?
Touch DNA has always been around, but the technology to analyze it has not been. As DNA kits become more and more sensitive, now we can actually analyze that touch DNA sample.
In 2010, the DNA swab from Bob's back pocket, which had been in storage since the murder, was processed by forensic technicians.
In this case, the back pocket of the victim was swabbed with a moistened swab with distilled water. That swab is then taken and cut for DNA analysis, and it's extracted, quantified, amplified, and ultimately a DNA profile is produced on the genetic analyzer.
A mixed DNA profile with two sources was generated from Bob's back pocket. One source, not surprisingly, was from Bob himself. The other source, so far unidentified, was almost certainly from Bob's killer.
There is no reason for someone's DNA to be there, except if they're the one who removed that wallet from that pocket.
Detectives were hopeful this profile would turn up a hit in the CODIS database, which contains the DNA profiles of thousands of known offenders.
It was run against the database, and there was no match.
The case went cold, yet again. But most criminals don't stop being criminals. And in this case, Bob's killer just couldn't stop breaking the law.
The whole thing is mind-boggling.
In 2009, St. Louis police arrested a convicted felon for forging a check. His name was Paul White.
Paul White was a career criminal. He'd been in and out of prison since he was a teenager.
So White's arrest was fairly routine. But what police did next was part of a new routine in police jurisdictions all over the country.
If you go back 15, 20 years, nobody's going to take your DNA when you get arrested. Now they do. White's DNA, a sample of his DNA was taken at the time he was arrested on a forgery case.
And that DNA was entered into the CODIS database, where computers automatically cross-referenced it with the DNA of thousands of criminals. Paul White's DNA matched the DNA from Bob's back pocket.
When I get that name from the crime labs, I couldn't control myself. I was very happy. This is the lead that is going to bring the individual to justice.
But did that prove Paul White was Bob's killer? Not necessarily. The two men had done business together.
Paul White's wife had her car insured through him, and he had gone in there and made a cash payment, so he knew there would have been cash there.
But Paul White insisted he was not in Bob's office the day of the murder.
The only time that I ever been in there was when we got insurance. Other than that, I've never been in there.
The DNA was pointing straight at Paul White, but a good defense lawyer might convince a jury it was there from his previous visit, even if it was months earlier.
If you have DNA in isolation, the defense can always argue, well, maybe there was contamination, maybe there was secondary transfer.
Detectives dug into Paul White's background and got a surprise. 1 month before Bob Eidman's murder, he'd been involved in yet another routine arrest.
Paul White was arrested for outstanding traffic tickets. He and his companion, a man named Cleo Hines, were both arrested as they were driving a Ford Focus.
The vehicle was white and had no license plates, which fit the description of the Ford Focus seen on surveillance video circling around Bob Eidman's office just before his murder.
That is a very big game changer.
By this time, more than 2 years had passed since Bob Eidman's murder, and Paul White was confident DNA could not tie him to the crime.
In the tapes of his interview, you can see that. When they tell him, we have your DNA in his pockets, well, he leaned back in his chair, put his arms behind his head, and smiled and laughed and said, his exact words were, there is no way on God's green earth you have my DNA in those pockets.
Your DNA comes back in the back pocket of Robert Eidman. Your DNA. Your DNA. Dude, listen. I just showed you.
I understand that, but I ain't nowhere in the world.
He was thinking what most people were thinking at that time, that you have to have a fluid for there to be DNA. He had no idea what the concept of touch DNA was.
Cleo Hines, Paul White's accomplice, understood more quickly and came clean. Prosecutors learned that Paul White recently lost more than $1,000 gambling, and since he'd been in Bob Eidman's office before, knew there should be lots of cash there. Bob knew him and could identify him, so the only way to get the money and not get caught was to kill Bob. Prosecutors believe Paul White shot Bob as soon as he and Cleo Hines entered the office. But there was a problem. Bob's money drawer was locked. In fact, it was broken and wouldn't open, something White hadn't counted on. Desperate, he rifled Bob's back pocket and grabbed his wallet, not realizing the touch DNA he left behind would ultimately identify him. How much money was Bob Eidman's life worth? $300.
They took the money to 2 separate casinos in the area and lost the money within hours.
How cold-blooded do you have to be to take that blood money and go to the casino and gamble with it? All murders are senseless, but this one just seemed to be in a category by itself.
Before the DNA match was made, Bob Eidman's wife, Diane, remained the #1 suspect. That match not only identified Bob's killers, it proved her innocence.
I'm happy to be able to solve a cold case using DNA. I'm also very happy when we get a case that exonerates an individual.
In August of 2012, Paul White was found guilty of first-degree murder and got life with no parole. Cleo Hines, convicted of second-degree murder and robbery, also got life in prison. All because they were convinced evidence they couldn't see couldn't possibly land them in jail.
No one was more surprised by the touch DNA results than Paul White was.
The fact that just the slightest brush on the inside of his victim's pocket could later convict him. It's incredible.
The victim's still dead. You can't fix that. But justice, I think, is something that we care about as a people. And when you get that DNA hit, it looks like we're going to get as close as we can come here to justice. It makes the job worthwhile.
Up next, a career sailor dies, but not in the line of duty.
To me, it's a waste of a human life.
Teams of doctors can't determine what killed this man.
It could be bacterial, like salmonella or cholera, something of that sort.
Or could it be something entirely unnatural, like murder?
What kind of person does that? How do you do that? Could you? No, I couldn't either.
In 1982, the Cold War was as frigid as ever. U.S. troops were deployed all over the globe. The Navy was perhaps the most visible branch of the service.
The Navy, when they deploy ships during peacetime, it's to just show the United States' presence and interest in various locations where foreign policy is being carried out by the United States.
37-year-old Lee Hartley was a Navy lieutenant aboard the USS Forrestal, America's first supercarrier, and at the time, one of the most formidable warships in the world. Capable of staying at sea for months, it provided cramped quarters for the lieutenant and more than 4,000 fellow sailors.
In its day, the Forrestal was a big modern aircraft carrier.
Lieutenant Hartley was a career Navy man, had risen up steadily through the ranks, and loved the work. 1 month into a standard deployment in the Mediterranean, he fell ill.
He's vomiting, he has diarrhea, he has severe stomach cramps. He goes to the clinic on board the ship.
Doctors on board diagnosed a stomach ailment, and soon Lieutenant Hartley was feeling better. But not for long.
They couldn't figure out the cause. They ruled out all infectious causes, other types of tumors and things of that sort, but they couldn't pin it down.
Lieutenant Hartley's condition stabilized, and then he took another turn for the worse.
He would be sick, and then he'd get a little bit better, and then be sick again, and meanwhile the doctors are trying to figure out what's going on.
Things got so bad that he was taken off the ship by helicopter and ended up at a Navy hospital in Florida. Under the care of his wife Pamela, Lieutenant Hartley continued to improve, but only briefly.
He's developing huge open sores in his mouth and his esophagus, is in extreme discomfort. On November the 17th, at 4 o'clock in the morning, he basically flatlines.
The next day, he died. An autopsy showed almost every vital organ in his body had sustained significant damage.
Doctor said, you need to look at heavy metal poisoning on this person. And so they took samples, sent them to SmithKline Laboratory. 6 days later, they get the positive results back that they find arsenic in Lee's system.
Arsenic is one of the oldest poisons known to man. It's a metals-based toxin found in all sorts of minerals.
Arsenic is a naturally occurring element in our world. It's found in the ground from geological formations, and it also is found in our water systems. In high levels of arsenic exposure, you have acute poisoning.
In healthy people, the liver filters out the trace amounts of arsenic all of us encounter. But in concentrated doses, it wreaks havoc on the body.
It's basically tasteless, odorless, and it's soluble in liquids. And so it's easy to hide.
And it's readily available. Arsenic is commonly found in rat poison. An analysis of Lee Hartley's organs showed his arsenic levels were over 400 times what's found in a healthy person. It's hard to ingest that much arsenic by accident, which raised all sorts of uncomfortable questions for people trying to determine exactly how Lee Hartley died.
Who has arsenic in their body of that level, unless it's a poisoning of some sort?
Upon learning that Lieutenant Lee Hartley had been killed by a massive dose of arsenic, the Navy sprang into action. If his death was an accident, 4,000 sailors on the USS Forrestal were in danger. If it was murder, one of those 4,000 could be a killer.
We're trying to figure out in the early stage now, where in the world did the arsenic come from?
His bunkmate was examined, as was the ship, all 60,000 tons of it.
They did an exhaustive search of the ship, and they could not identify any type of arsenic on board the ship.
That meant someone got the arsenic on board, dosed Lieutenant Hartley, and successfully destroyed all signs of it. Not an easy thing to do.
Don't forget, we had no idea at the time where this stuff came from. You know, we knew it didn't fall to earth from heaven, but we had no idea how it got where it was.
The immediate question was simple. Was there anyone on board who might want to kill Lieutenant Hartley? The answer was an unequivocal yes.
There was a report that somebody had written Hartley's a dead man or Lieutenant's a dead man or something of that sort on the ship.
Lieutenant Hartley was in a unique position on the Forrestal. His job was to report all infractions of discipline. It was a thankless task and potentially dangerous.
I much hate to say it. If you are the disciplinary officer on board, it's totally conceivable that somebody might wish you harm. And I'm sure that Lee, like myself and others, probably avoided going out on the weather decks at night.
Lee Hartley told friends he was reluctant to go out on this latest deployment. Why? He'd only been married to Pamela for a year, and many of his shipmates said he desperately missed her.
That was my singular recollection of him at the time, was that he really, really wanted to be home and really missed being home with his wife.
In fact, when he initially fell ill, doctors, who had no idea at the time that he'd ingested a lethal dose of arsenic, wondered if he might be suicidal.
They had actually asked him in the hospital whether or not he was trying to kill himself, and he was telling them that no, he doesn't want to die.
And if he did want to kill himself, why do it in one of the slowest, most painful ways possible? But the possibility of self-harm led to another theory.
I was of the opinion initially that perhaps in an effort to have himself sent home early from the ship, that he might have started to take something that contained arsenic that would make him sufficiently sick to be able to go home.
But again, his suffering was so extreme that investigators were skeptical about the possibility of self-harm. With no sign of the source of arsenic on the ship, they were stumped.
The investigation had basically gone cold.
That is, until they heard a story about Lieutenant Hartley and another shipmate getting violently ill while on shore leave in Spain, just 3 months before the lieutenant's death.
That's one of the first things that you do, of course, is you look at the universe of possibilities. Later on, the universe of possibilities becomes smaller and smaller and smaller.
As Navy Lieutenant Lee Hartley lay dying in a Florida hospital, one of his doctors thought he might have been poisoned. As a result, at the lieutenant's autopsy, doctors specifically tested for toxins, and they saved samples for later analysis.
They'll take specific samples like brain tissue, liver tissue, kidney tissue, lungs, stomach contents.
Arsenic is retained longer in the fingernails and hair than in any other part of the body.
Arsenic is bound in organic matter differently than it is in our body, to where it goes to inorganic stuff. It goes to our keratin, it goes to our nails and our hair, because that's where the high keratin cells are.
And since the arsenic will stay there indefinitely, it can provide a record of exactly when a person ingests arsenic.
Your hair on your head grows about 1/2 inch a month. So when they do testing, they say take a lock of your hair. You want to take like a pencil's width of hair, 3 inches long. That will give you information for about 6 months. If you test it out at the 3 inch, that's 6 months from the initial exposure.
To create a forensic timeline for when Lieutenant Hartley ingested the arsenic, his hair samples were subjected to a process called atomic absorption spectroscopy. The hair is liquefied in a neutral solution. A radioactive beam is then sent through the samples. How much this light is able to pass through reveals how much arsenic is present, allowing analysts to trace the rate of ingestion. This showed that Lieutenant Hartley got an initial dose of arsenic while he was 1 month out to sea. And there was a massive spike 1 month later, around the time he was on shore leave with the rest of the Forrestal crew in Spain. While there, he finally reunited with his wife, Pam.
Pam would have come over with 100 other wives, probably. 100 or 200 wives typically go from port to port if they can afford the flight over, and then they can reunite with their husband for a week if we're in port that long.
During this time in Spain, Pam cooked breakfast for Lieutenant Hartley and another shipmate. Soon, both were sick.
Lee and his crewmate get violently ill, complaining of diarrhea and vomiting. Lee is noted by Pamela to be ashen, gray in color. She stays 8 days before returning home from visiting her husband.
Both men returned to the ship. Lee Hartley's crewmate recovered. Lieutenant Hartley did not. At least, not completely. Doctors and investigators wondered if there might be some connection between the lieutenant's wife and his death. The couple had been married for a little more than a year. They met in the Navy. Lee Hartley, who'd been previously married for 16 years and had a young daughter, was Pamela's superior.
I know that he was her boss. She was a secretary at his office. That's how I found out. My mom told me that was his secretary.
Adultery is not permissible in the Navy, so Lee and Pam's affair created a problem.
He basically paved the way for her to get out of the Navy after only being in there for 2 years. And once she left the Navy and they could then date, even though he was married, he went and eventually divorced his wife and then married Pamela.
By all accounts, Lieutenant Hartley was besotted with his new wife, who was 10 years his junior.
She was very soft-spoken. It was different from my mom's, you know, the way she would talk to me and stuff, and I think that's why I liked her more.
The post-mortem analysis of the lieutenant's hair left no doubt he got a big dose of arsenic while in Spain with his wife. Could Pam be involved? It was an open question. After all, Lieutenant Hartley suffered his first bout of sickness 1 month after he was at sea, and Pam clearly wasn't on the ship. Even stranger, he had subsequent bouts of illness long after he was with Pam in Spain. And then, once the lieutenant got back to the U.S. and was in Pam's care, hair analysis showed his arsenic levels had nearly quadrupled.
This is the crux of the case. This is where it turns from, okay, maybe she's not the grieving widow. Pam was identified as a logical suspect because she had the most access and the opportunity.
Forensic analysis of Lieutenant Hartley's hair made it clear he got a large dose of arsenic while visiting his wife, Pam, in Spain. Investigators learned that the lieutenant's shipmate, the one who became ill after eating a breakfast prepared by Pam Hartley, was now in good health. So much time had passed that he'd cut his hair and fingernails, eliminating any potential evidence.
One of the obstacles that we had to overcome very rapidly is we don't have a crime scene.
If Pam Hartley poisoned her husband before she met him in Spain, and again after they left, how did she do it? After all, she was thousands of miles away. The answer was hiding in plain sight.
Lo and behold, she had sent care packages to Lee, maybe some baked goods, little things that people can't find on the ship or whatever, to send to them.
Sailors received these so-called care packages from family members during ports of call.
When she's sending him something on the ship, he's ingesting enough that he's getting sick.
Early in the investigation, Pam Hartley had been brought in for questioning and denied any involvement. She even consented to a polygraph and passed.
It does tend to throw a monkey wrench into a homicide investigation if your primary suspect passes a polygraph.
Everything pointed to Pam, but there wasn't enough to charge her. There's no statute of limitations on murder, and nearly 13 years later, in 1995, investigators prepared to re-interview Pam Hartley and other people with even a remote connection to the case.
They went back and interviewed some of the people, including her brother, who's told a different version of the story, what he initially told back in the 80s.
Pam's brother, Fred, dropped a bombshell.
Pretty quickly, he gave her up and said that she had approached him about killing Lee Hartley. And of course, he refused.
Investigators could finally make a case. Also, they knew that Lieutenant Hartley's body, he had been buried, not cremated, could be a rich source of evidence. Arsenic should still be in his hair and fingernails. All they had to do was exhume him. It was time to confront Pam.
It seems to me that there would have been nothing to lose at that point to go ahead and have a serious come-to-Jesus type interrogation with her.
Eventually, we do what we call a showdown. When we sit down with the most likely suspect, we want it to be a surprise.
Pam, who was short on money and fighting a substance abuse problem, was told her brother had given her up. Even worse for her, the evidence, 6 feet under the ground, was just waiting to be tested. Faced with an almost certain conviction, she confessed.
Sometimes people want to confess, and they got the feeling that that was true with Pam Hartley.
As for motive, investigators were stunned. Pam said she knew Lee was madly in love with her. He was also jealous and controlling. She wanted out of the marriage, but didn't want to break his heart by getting a divorce.
It's kind of ironic. She said, I loved him so much I didn't want to divorce him. So she kills him.
This was cold-blooded murder, planned and executed over months.
I was numb. I was numb when I found out that my dad had been murdered. I was numb.
The forensic timeline shows Lieutenant Hartley got a care package only weeks into his deployment. He got sick and recovered. Then Pam met him in Spain and dosed him again. He fell ill and recovered. She gave him a care package before he reboarded the ship. He ate the contents, and the pattern repeated. Another care package arrived in September, and Lieutenant Hartley's condition deteriorated. He was medevaced from the ship and hospitalized in Florida, where Pam continued poisoning him until he died.
I mean, you can't imagine, here's somebody that you cared enough about to marry, and they are willing, over time, to watch you slowly deteriorate to the extent you're slowly wasting away and dying. I mean, what kind of malevolence causes that in a person? I mean, where does that come from?
In 1996, Pam Hartley, 39 years old, pled guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 40 years in prison. She was released after 16 years. She declined to participate in this production. The senselessness of this crime is the one thing all the investigators can agree upon. And they're grateful science finally solved the mystery of what killed Lieutenant Lee Hartley.
It's hard to dispute the science. The manner of death in this would be homicide. So that toxicology played a significant role in establishing that timeline.
The forensics were so important in this case. It wasn't until, one doctor came in and looked at everything that was going on that identified that they needed to start looking for this poison. People probably wonder, well, why didn't she just get a divorce?
Up next, 2 people are attacked, only 1 survives.
This is a very violent crime.
The fact that he ran out of the apartment, left her there, it just looks suspicious.
Are you saying I did it?
I'm saying it certainly looks like it.
They just had no idea who did it. I think everybody was a suspect.
Until a partial bloody fingerprint finally helps identify the killer.
We knew that it did come from the suspect, and that was a really key piece of evidence.
After graduating from college in 2004, Jonna Berry set her sights on being a lawyer.
She was the youngest girl ever accepted into law school in Michigan. She thought she wanted to go into law.
But after a few weeks, Jonna decided that being a lawyer wasn't for her. The academically gifted 21-year-old decided to be a child psychologist.
She loved any child. She babysat and kept kids, and her life revolved around children.
Though this was an easy decision professionally, it was a tough one personally. Jonna left her fiancé in Michigan and moved back to Tennessee.
Jonna and her fiance talked every night on the phone. He was in Michigan, a law student. Both had such big plans, and they talked every night until John would fall asleep, which was kind of sweet.
Once she decided to move, Jonna reached out to an old friend from her undergraduate days, Jason Amami.
He had an extra bedroom, and he invited her to share the rent with him until she could find her own apartment.
Jason's girlfriend was also friends with Jonna, so they all knew each other from college.
Shortly before dawn, on a December morning, Jonna's roommate, Jason, said he awoke to find a knife-wielding man in their apartment. He confronted the man, who stabbed him repeatedly. Jason, spattered with blood, ran out the front door and into a convenience store down the street, where he yelled for the clerk to call 911.
Knox County 911.
There's a man that just walked in the store. He's heavily bloodied. Looks like he's been in a fight.
Is it in an ambulance?
His roommate's still in there. Apparently somebody broke into his house.
Okay, can I talk to him, please? Okay. Now, what happened?
We're both sleeping. I just felt somebody stab me right in my chest.
Somebody stabbed you?
Hit me in my face. And that's the first thing I did was get up and run.
Okay, what about your roommate? Is he okay?
She was screaming very loud.
Okay.
I didn't have any time. I just got out of there.
First responders arrived to find Jonna Berry face down near the front door of her apartment building, covered in blood.
She was semi-conscious. She couldn't respond to any of their questions, but she'd obviously been stabbed multiple times.
She had stab wounds just about all over every part of her body, head, face, neck, some on her back. She had some defensive wounds.
Jonna died shortly after arriving at the emergency room. She'd been stabbed more than 20 times. There was no sign of sexual assault. Her roommate, Jason, suffered 9, mostly superficial, stab wounds, and one wound on his right hand raised all sorts of questions for investigators.
The cut on Jason Amami's hand was extremely suspicious because it's a type of cut that is very common with knife slippage. During an attack, if you're sweaty or bloody, that slipperiness allows the hand to slip from the handle part of the knife onto the blade.
The wound to Jason's hand was far from the only thing that was suspicious. There was no sign of forced entry. The murder weapon was a kitchen knife from inside the apartment. And that many wounds often indicates a prior relationship between the victim and the killer.
Jason being in the same apartment with her, his wounds not being as severe as Jonna's, it led us to believe that he had something to do with this in some way.
She didn't have any enemies, none. I guess at that time I thought, could he have done this?
There were 3 blood trails at the scene of Jonna Berry's murder, 1 out the back door and 2 out the front.
There was blood on doors of other apartments, and investigators realized she had gone to every apartment after having been stabbed 26 times, banging on the door or at least pushing on the door trying to get help as best she could, and no one answered.
Jana's family, in shock when informed of her murder, told police they had no idea who would want her dead.
You don't know what to do. You have no clue what you're supposed to do. There's nothing you're supposed to do in a situation like that.
It was just a tragic, unbelievable thing, and I don't think I had myself together, at that time.
Jana's fiancé was confirmed to be in Michigan at the time of the murder and was never a suspect. All attention now turned to Jana's roommate, Jason Emami.
I came home from the gym and the door was locked. I remember having to put my key in and unlock the door.
He walked detectives through the crime scene.
I came back here to go to bed after coming from the bathroom and put my alarm clock to 5:30.
He told them that he went to bed at midnight and woke up hours later when he heard Jana screaming.
He said that Jana has a history of sleepwalking, sometimes even maybe having nightmares. He thought that was what was going on.
Jason, whose bedroom was right next to Jana's, said he got up to check on her.
Jason said when he opened his bedroom door, he was confronted by a male that was walking out of or backing out of Jana's bedroom.
He pushed me back this way and I fell on the bed like this. Hard shove? Yeah, it was a fairly hard shove. I remember hitting my head right here.
He said the male started stabbing him. He kind of balled up in a fetal position to protect himself, try and protect himself from the stabbing. He said he ended up kicking the individual kind of in the growing area, kicked him back off of him.
I took off and I ran as fast as I could this way.
The question now was whether Jason's story would match up with the other evidence at the scene. A partial bloody fingerprint was recovered from the blade of the murder weapon.
They weren't able to successfully remove that fingerprint. What they were able to do was to take high-resolution photographs of the fingerprint.
But even with this high-quality photograph, the print was too partial and too blood-smeared to be entered into the AFIS database. In Jason's bedroom, investigators found a partial shoe print in blood.
A small piece of cardboard that had been left there where he had purchased some dress shirts. We knew that it could possibly came from the suspect.
Detectives sent the shoe print to the FBI, which maintains the largest shoe print database in the world, nicknamed Soul Searcher. Some 30,000 images are on file. Unlike AFIS, the fingerprint database, or IBIS, a ballistics database, Soul Searcher looks for shapes rather than attempting a direct comparison.
The footwear database here, we are not looking to identify a particular shoe. We are trying to compare and determine general brand or make of that shoe.
It works by comparing different characteristics on the sole of the shoe.
Some of those shapes might be circles, some of them might be squares or rectangles, layered rectangles, zigzags, wave patterns. And you can specify where on that impression if you know. If you have a heel, you can specify that that particular circle is on the heel.
When the print from Jana's crime scene was entered, the database returned 32 potential matches.
I was able to quickly scan through and determine that there was only one possibility, and that was the Faded Glory Gannon.
The shoe was sold exclusively by Walmart, which narrowed things down, but still meant a lot of possibilities. As detectives attempted to run them down, and as blood at the scene was being analyzed for DNA, investigators asked Jason Emami to take a polygraph test, and he agreed. It didn't go well.
Then tell me why you failed that.
I have no idea why.
And you didn't fail it. You didn't come close.
I have no idea at all.
Jason became really irate with the polygrapher.
I don't care what that box says. I voluntarily took this. If I had something to hide, why would I take this test? I live my life in fear knowing this guy is still out there. I closed my...
Was Jason lying? Or was he what he claimed to be? Another victim of the crime. With so much blood at the scene, detectives hoped the DNA would reveal the answer. DNA testing on blood at Jonna Berry's crime scene revealed profiles from 3 people: Jonna, her roommate Jason Amami, who said he was wounded at the scene, and a third profile from an unknown male.
It was found on the knife. It was found on the doorknob leading out the back door of the apartment, and the droplets of blood led down the back stairwell.
The finding of blood from an unknown male meant Jason had been telling the truth all along. Another unknown man had shed blood in the apartment. So how had Jason failed the polygraph? It turned out the person administering the test not only ignored a series of standard protocols, he misread the results.
The results were looked at again. It was revealed that he did indeed pass that test.
I don't have a dog in this fight. All I'm trying to determine is the truth.
I have told you the 100% truth.
It wasn't really the polygrapher's place to confront the person that was taking the test. That's supposed to be left up to the detective that's working the case.
Jason immediately went from chief suspect to chief witness. His description of the killer was run through a computer. The information was refined by a technician until Jason signed off on this image.
He described the person as 5'8", stocky, 180 pounds, white male, but more specifically, he was able to indicate that he had teardrop or pecan-shaped eyes that the composite really highlighted.
We aired it almost every night in the hopes of trying to find who did this to Jonna.
This is who sheriff's investigators are trying to identify. He's in his 20s, about 5 feet 8 inches tall, 150 pounds.
And that led to a lot of tips.
As those tips were tracked down, detectives, hopeful the DNA would expose the killer, were dealt a setback. The CODIS database did not reveal the identity of the unknown male.
The CODIS database doesn't contain juveniles, and it doesn't contain people who haven't been convicted of crimes, so we knew that we were dealing with somebody who was a rather novice in terms of committing crimes.
Finally, one of the tips appeared to be solid. The potential suspect was a 19-year-old named Michael Percival.
Percival lived about 2 miles away from the crime scene, and he was active in some criminal activity, burglaries and things of that nature.
When detectives went to pick him up, he was barefoot. He asked a detective to get his shoes.
That detective retrieved the shoes. She punched me in the arm, and her eyes were kind of the size of saucers. We both couldn't believe it because those shoes were an actual pair of faded Glory Gannon shoes. The tread on the bottom appeared to be the same as what was left behind at the crime scene on the cardboard in Jason Amami's bedroom.
It looked like investigators had found their man, a theory only confirmed after Percival was in custody.
And he indicated that he, in fact, had been present when Jonna Berry was killed, that he had gone over to Jonna's house with another person, that that person had gone in the back and had committed the stabbing.
But parts of Percival's story didn't add up. He claimed he forced himself into Jonna's apartment with a crowbar, which was clearly not true. His shoes, while the same make and style as the shoe print at the scene, were not an exact match.
The FBI concluded that that shoe had a different wear pattern than the shoes that had left the bloody shoe print in Jason Amami's bedroom.
And, in a development beyond dispute, his DNA did not match DNA from the unidentified male. Percival had duped investigators who lost precious time investigating his story.
We kind of learned that Michael was an attention seeker, that he was trying to put himself in the middle of this for attention, to be involved in this crime in some way.
That was very upsetting to know that someone would say that they committed a horrible crime like this and not have done it.
Even worse, the investigation was now back to square one and was growing colder by the day. Jonna's family put up a $70,000 reward.
Anything to keep it in the public's eye was the only way we figured our daughter's murder would ever be caught.
Whatever opportunity we had, we would do it. We had billboards, anything that we could do.
The case looked like it might go unsolved. But then, some 2 years after Jonna's murder, a suspect with an incredible resemblance to the composite sketch finally emerged. Jonna Barry's family seized every opportunity to keep her case alive. This computer-generated composite sketch was a regular sight in Knoxville. In June of 2007, an anonymous tipster told police they should check out 22-year-old Taylor Olson.
Taylor Olson had a juvenile record. He was known for breaking into cars, nothing major, but enough to have police and sheriff's officers know who he was.
Taylor Olson was not somebody that we would say, by looking at his rap sheet, that he was conclusively the killer.
By this time, 2 years had passed, and it was unlikely that whoever killed Jonna still had the shoes that left the bloody shoe print at the scene. Taylor Olson didn't, but he did own a pair when Jonna was killed.
Taylor's mother and ex-girlfriend identified those shoes. They said, hey, he doesn't have them anymore, but he once wore them. In fact, he wore them at the time of Jonna's murder.
Detectives got Taylor Olson's DNA, and soon afterward got a stunning call from the lab. The DNA of the unidentified man who left a trail of blood in Jonna's apartment had finally been identified.
When we got the phone call that we had gotten a match on the unknown DNA sample, it was a shock. It was unbelievable, couldn't believe it. We had finally gotten somebody that was responsible for the murder.
In September of 2007, Taylor Olson was arrested for Jonna's murder. His hand showed a couple of linear scars of the type made by a knife. He still denied any involvement.
I can't believe that y'all tell me that my blood's there. That my blood's all down this knife, and like, how the did it get there?
You got there because you were there.
He still says, there's no way, I wasn't there, my DNA's not there, y'all made a mistake.
Eventually, Olson admitted he was in the area that night, looking for open apartments to steal keys to a car. He said Jonna's back door was unlocked. He entered and eventually made his way to her bedroom. According to Olson, Jonna attacked him with a knife, and he simply defended himself.
Freaked out. And I don't know, and I can't believe this happened.
You got the knife away from that person and just went kind of crazy?
Yeah. I guess they were sleeping with it.
Prosecutors didn't buy the story. They believe Olson found the apartment's back door open and picked up a knife as he searched for something to steal. He went into Jonna's bedroom. Startled, she woke up and confronted him. Olson apparently panicked and frantically stabbed her, over and over. His hand slipped on the bloody knife, cutting him. He began shedding blood. He left Jonna's room and was met by Jason Amami, who he also attacked, creating even more blood evidence. He left a bloody shoe print on the piece of cardboard on Jason's floor. His DNA was on the murder weapon and in the blood trail he created as he escaped out the back door. His prints were ultimately matched back to the partial print on the bloody knife. Taylor Olson didn't know Jonna. Investigators have no explanation for the level of violence with which he attacked her. After his arrest, even he seemed at a loss for an explanation.
Did you mean to kill her? Was it an accident? But you stabbed her 26 times.
How can you say it was an accident? He could have left. He didn't have to just keep on and on stabbing her, and he didn't have to do that. No, it wasn't no accident.
In March of 2008, as the day of his trial approached, Taylor Olson was found dead in his jail cell.
So he hung himself in the Knox County Jail. It's called a coward's admission of guilt.
I'm thankful that I had Jonna for 21 years. I'd rather have had her for 21 years than to never had her at all. So I'm very grateful for that. But at the same time, I'm also mad that she was taken away.
The Berry family created a support group called Hope for Victims. They also work to change state laws to allow for collection of DNA from anyone arrested for a violent crime.
Law enforcement can only do so much. They can only work with the tools that they have, and they need better tools to work with.
That one little hit on the DNA for the blood, that solved the whole case. It takes all the question out.
The forensic evidence was critical to the resolution of this case. There would be no case if Taylor Olson hadn't bled and he'd gotten away. If he hadn't have been injured during the attack, this case would have never been solved.
Up next, the quiet of the Pennsylvania countryside is shattered by gunfire.
You had a murder in a church in broad daylight.
Hello?
Shocking. Absolutely shocking.
A horrified community looks for answers and finds none.
It's the kind of stuff that books and horror movies are made out of.
Police have no suspects and few clues.
There was very little forensic evidence for them to go on. And then they hit the jackpot.
Trinity Evangelical Lutheran Church in rural eastern Pennsylvania is one of the oldest and best preserved churches in the region, dating all the way back to 1763.
Trinity Lutheran predates the Revolution. You can walk through their cemetery and see the old limestone. You can barely read the names on it. And it's still a very active parish even after a couple hundred years.
The center of the community for generations, the church is nestled in the rolling countryside of Bucks County, a getaway destination for people from New York to Philadelphia and points in between.
It's a throwback to yesteryear. People didn't worry about any crime. Neighbors knew each other. Kids played in the backyards.
But that all changed on a January afternoon in 2008. The church's cleaning lady arrived shortly after 1 o'clock.
She opens the door to the church office, and at first she doesn't see anything until she approaches the desk. There's blood all over the place, and she places this hysterical 911 call to Bucks County Dispatch.
Where's the emergency? Ma'am, hello? Okay, what's the problem? There's a girl murdered in our office. There's a girl what? Murdered! She's laying behind the desk, full of blood.
Even before paramedics arrived, the cleaning lady gave investigators a potential clue.
When was the last time you were there, or you know of anyone being at the church? It's not usually open like during the day or anything like that? The church doors are never open. So did you have to unlock it to get in today? No, it was unlocked today.
In the church office, paramedics found a woman on the floor, barely alive, apparently shot at point-blank range. The fatal bullet, or bullets, police couldn't tell yet, had been fired at such close range, they'd actually shredded.
When we heard about the shooting at the church, it was almost bewildering to imagine something like that happening at that church in that community.
The victim died minutes after arriving at the hospital. Her name was Rhonda Smith. 42 years old and single, she was a relatively new member of the church congregation, respected and apparently liked by everyone.
She came from a nice family, but she had had her problems. She had suffered from depression.
Whoever wanted Rhonda dead apparently knew where she was going to be and when, and came in with only one purpose: murder.
We know it wasn't a random attack because there was an execution-style shot in her temple that was done in anger. That person, the killer, wanted Rhonda Smith dead.
But who and why? Was there something about Rhonda Smith that her fellow parishioners didn't know? So many questions. But one thing was not in doubt. A cold-blooded killer was lurking somewhere in this normally peaceful community. Rural eastern Pennsylvania doesn't see a lot of murders, and the area around Trinity Lutheran Church had never seen the type of execution killing that claimed the life of church member Rhonda Smith.
This was not a robbery situation. She was specifically targeted for whatever reason. And that was the key to finding out who did it. What was the motive for doing this?
The autopsy showed 2 bullets had been fired at close range. So close that Rhonda had attempted to defend herself. The gun was not at the scene. But even though the fatal bullets had shredded upon impact, ballistics experts were able to determine the murder weapon was a .38 caliber handgun. The murder happened so fast, the killer left no clues besides the bullets at the scene. And in an area this rural, there were no security cameras. The timing of the murder was key.
They were looking for someone who knew Rhonda Smith was in that office on that day at that hour.
The problem was that as far as police could determine, only 2 people knew. The church pastor, who was apparently out of town, and the church council president. Both unlikely killers, but their whereabouts for the time of the murder still needed to be checked out.
The pastor had a unique background. He was a golf pro who toured around playing golf, and then he left that lifestyle and became a pastor to a church located really in the middle of Nowheresville.
Police got a possible clue while trying to determine the time of the shooting. Rhonda was found shortly after 1 o'clock. A search of the church computer showed she was online until around 11. This created a time window for the shooting and also revealed something about Rhonda.
We seized the computer, sent it to the forensic computer analyst. They were able to give us exactly what Rhonda was doing on the internet in the moments before she was shot.
And what she was doing was searching a dating website. Rhonda's search for romance was something of a new start after a couple of very difficult years.
She was diagnosed as being bipolar. She got help for that, but it set her back, and it was a debilitating mental illness for her that she fortunately found a church and found a community that welcomed her with open arms and actually gave her a lot of assistance, both financially and also emotionally.
Because of that help, Rhonda had recently moved out of her parents' house and was on her own for the first time in years. In fact, the pastor gave her the job as church secretary to help her with money.
Approximately 10 days before her murder, she got up during church services and she wanted to thank all the members of the congregation for what they had done for her and how much it meant to her.
She loved this church, and we loved her. We embraced her, and she embraced us.
A beautiful moment, shattered by nagging suspicions that a church member could also be her killer.
So the tension in the church after, the process of elimination and figuring out that it could be somebody within the community, somebody within the church, everybody was on edge.
Police confronted the pastor with a pointed question. Was there anyone in his congregation who might have done this?
There's no question that the pastor was in a very difficult situation.
A situation that would become even more difficult when police discovered a long-simmering romantic obsession.
And that's when I think they started to develop the idea of possibly being a rebuked love interest.
The only people who appeared to know where Rhonda Smith would be at the time of her murder, the pastor and the church council president, had solid alibis. Still, the church community was reeling.
It's not only that it was a murder, It was probably the worst kind because it was a murder mystery. And in a small town, nobody knew who among them was the killer.
The shocked pastor was asked about concerns he might have about any member of his congregation. Reluctantly, he named longtime parishioner Mary Jane Fonder.
Mary Jane had said something to him like, I know what's going on between us. I can feel it. You can feel it too.
And this really freaks him out. And he asked her to leave the church.
Despite this rebuff, Mary Jane regularly put food in the pastor's refrigerator and left long, rambling messages on his voicemail.
And they would just go on and on and on. He got to the point he wouldn't listen to them, and this was just like a daily occurrence.
So it's up to you if you want to have a discussion about life matters at the present time today.
Whatever conversation you started, she would take down 3 garden paths and then make a right turn and continue.
So anyway, I'm busy at home watching the squirrel eating outside and enjoying this beautiful sunny day.
Mary Jane Fonder never had a meaningful romantic relationship in her life, and she develops a crush on the pastor.
And that pastor was helping Rhonda Smith by giving her part-time work at the church.
Mary Jane had uttered some disgruntled words about, why is she being favored over me? I've done all this volunteer work. I'm the one that's been here and no one's done anything for me.
But this was hardly proof of murder, and Mary Jane had no criminal history. However, she was linked to yet another extraordinarily strange case. 14 years earlier, her father disappeared without a trace from the home they shared.
Mary Jane Fonder came on our radar in 1993 with the disappearance of her father when she reported him missing.
He was 80 years old and had 2 hip replacements. He needed a cane to walk. He didn't walk away.
Despite a massive search with helicopters, bloodhounds, and even ground-penetrating radar, no sign of Edward Fonder has ever been found.
They dug up the basement, they dug up areas around the house, to no avail, with nothing found there at the property. But he's out there somewhere.
Back then, police thought Mary Jane Fonder might have had something to do with her father's disappearance, but they couldn't prove it. Now, they thought she might have killed Rhonda Smith, and they had the same problem. No proof.
In terms of physical evidence, in the church, we have nothing. All we have is we have a body, and we don't have a gun.
But there was one piece of potential evidence: the missing murder weapon. Ballistics showed it was a .38 caliber, and Mary Jane once owned a .38 caliber. She told police she got rid of it after people started connecting her to her father's disappearance.
Mary Jane told people that the reporters and the police started showing up at her house asking those questions about, her involvement in her father's disappearance. And she went to the lake and threw it away.
Investigators weren't so sure.
Ultimately, we were able to put together enough for a search warrant of her car.
And that turned up the first piece of possible evidence: gunshot residue. This is created anytime a gun is fired. The explosion that propels the bullet creates gas that inevitably blows back over the hand and clothing of the shooter.
Gunshot residue is comparable to flour that you spill. You clean it up, but you never clean it. It's never gone. It seems like it's always there.
And sure enough, there were minute traces of gunshot residue in Mary Jane's car. But there was a problem.
We did quite an extensive amount of research, and apparently the most prevalent place for gunshot residue, other than the range where people go to shoot their guns, is the police station.
And since analysts didn't completely clean up before the search of Mary Jane's car, the defense could argue that they put the gunshot residue there. And that meant the investigation was back to square one. Until something strange happened. Something many church members later called an act of God. Mary Jane Fonder appeared to be the only person with a motive to kill Rhonda Smith, who she apparently considered a rival for the affections of their church pastor.
Rhonda Smith was a single woman. The pastor was single at the time. Mary Jane Fonder thought he was hers.
Mary Jane was not right in the head.
But despite an intensive investigation, police still had no solid evidence.
The greatest worry on my part and also on the investigators was that we would never be able to solve this case. And things were looking bleak, to be honest with you.
Then, 9 weeks after the murder, a local man was fishing with his son at a lake just 14 miles from the site of the murder when they made an unusual discovery.
The boy, he was 7 or 8 years old. He's walking along the shore of the lake, and he finds a gun. His father takes it home and calls the police. They run the serial number, and there you go. It's Mary Jane Fonder's gun.
Analysis confirmed that the gun was the gun that was used in the murder of Rhonda Smith.
It's a prosecutor's dream. I mean, they think they have it.
With the gun in hand, prosecutors finally had enough to search Mary Jane's house. They didn't find any direct evidence, but they did find something unusual in her day planner.
There was a block for the date of the murder, and she had written in Rhonda Smith murdered, and underneath that was haircut appointment.
As odd as this was, it didn't prove murder, and Mary Jane stuck to her story that she threw the gun in the lake 14 years earlier.
Her story was anybody could have gotten that gun and used that gun to kill Rhonda Smith.
In the end, it all came down to the gun. Prosecutors had to find a way to prove how long the gun had been in the water, and turned to Dr. David Rusak, an analytical chemist at the University of Scranton.
The task was to determine the maximum length of time which the gun could have been exposed to the water.
To do this, Dr. Rusak used a high-speed chemical analysis process called laser-induced breakdown spectroscopy, or LIBS.
A pulsed laser is focused onto the surface of a sample, and when the laser strikes the sample, it vaporizes a small portion of it and creates a spark.
The laser is so powerful, more than 10,000 degrees Celsius, that these tiny sparks expose the unique chemical composition of almost any sample.
And the light from the spark is collected by a spectrometer and photographed. And the photograph then gives you an idea of the composition of the sample that was struck by the laser.
In this case, the gun had what's known as blued steel, a protective coating that gave the gun its black color. The LIBS analysis showed that the bluing on this gun was unusually thin. As a result, if the gun had been in the water for 14 years, it would show a lot more corrosion.
There's no way that gun laid in the bottom of the lake for 14 years. And we know that because there was no signs of corrosion on the weapon.
Prosecutors say the tipping point for Mary Jane was when Rhonda Smith got in front of the congregation and gave a tearful thank you for all their help. That and the church pastor offering Rhonda work was simply too much, and Mary Jane put her plan for murder into action. As an active member of the church, she had a good idea of when Rhonda worked. Simply drove to the church, walked into the office, and shot her at point-blank range. Then she made her haircut appointment in an attempt to establish an alibi, and threw the murder weapon into the lake on the way home. Her key mistake: she didn't throw it far enough into the water.
The gun is the holy grail of this case. Had they not found that gun, Mary Jane Fonder would not have been arrested and charged with Rhonda Smith's murder. It's as simple as that.
Never shot Rhonda. I never killed that woman.
As the trial progressed, prosecutors got yet another surprise.
The lead trooper in the case whispers in my ear, "Hey Dave, she's wearing Rhonda's sneakers." And sure enough, she was wearing Rhonda Smith sneakers.
Oddly enough, Mary Jane got the sneakers from Rhonda's parents after she'd gone to their house to express condolences about Rhonda's murder.
Mrs. Smith looks down and sees that she's wearing these beat-up, old-time galoshes, and says to her, "Listen, my daughter, I have brand new sneakers upstairs. Let me give them to you."
And in an ironic twist to an already strange case, Mary Jane wore them to court.
What kind of a person would do that when you're there charged with murder of Rhonda Smith? And that's somebody who has ice running through their veins.
It was as cold as you can imagine.
Are you worried about spending the rest of your life in prison?
It doesn't sound appealing.
In October of 2008, Mary Jane Fonder was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. She died behind bars of a heart attack 10 years later.
This one boils down to the fact that a woman who looks like a grandmother and has a kind face and a giving nature, you would never suppose would be jealous to the point where she would want to kill another parishioner who was also down on her luck and looking for friends and to be part of a community.
She walked in the church that day with a gun in her hand, and there were no questions asked. It was kaboom, kaboom.
I like to say hello to my congregation till I miss them all. I'm praying for everybody.
It was all an act. You want to see the real Mary Jane Fonder? You take a look at her prison mugshot. Because you look at her, she's looking right at you. She's going to kill you. She's going to take you out.
Up next, they're all veterans. They're all elderly. And they all die in strangely similar circumstances.
We knew Dad was not well. We just thought it was his time.
This cluster of deaths alarms medical investigators.
It's not only a whodunit, it's a whatdunit.
The bodies of the dead men are exhumed. Can they speak from the grave to reveal what killed them?
To this day, I still cannot put into words what these families endured.
We had to prove what happened and who did it.
There was nothing we weren't going to do to ensure justice.
Robert Kozol spent most of his life in Fairmont, West Virginia, a rural town about 25 miles from the border with Pennsylvania. He built a house there and raised two boys with Shirley, his wife of 43 years.
He tried to do everything that was the right way the first time, and he tried to teach those values to my brother Bob and I, and I think he did a good job of it.
One place Robert Kozol learned those values was during his military service as a paratrooper with the U.S. Army's 11th Airborne Division at Fort Campbell, Kentucky.
He was proud to be a veteran. He was proud of the service he did for his country. He loved his country more than anything.
In January of 2018, Bob Kozol had a health scare and was eventually sent to a nearby Veterans Affairs hospital, the Lewis A. Johnson Medical Center in Clarksburg, West Virginia.
It's a very busy hospital. I know folks come from northern West Virginia, from all over, to go there because a lot of the folks that live around here are veterans, particularly the older folks.
He had been going for all of his visits and his doctoring on a regular basis up there. So we had no problem taking him to the VA.
Initial testing indicated Bob suffered a minor stroke. It wasn't life-threatening, but doctors had him stay at the hospital overnight for observation.
So we all went home, and we felt that he was going to be safe and well taken care of.
The next day, Bob's family went to check on him and found him disoriented and unable to speak.
was wrong. His sugar was low and they just didn't know why. But they were just giving him some sugar and trying to get it to come back up, and he should be okay once they got it up.
But that didn't happen. Bob Kozel died. And at first, doctors weren't sure what killed him. He was 89 years old.
There was a lot of question at that point, and we didn't have any answers.
2 other elderly veterans died shortly after Bob Kozel. Like him, they suffered hypoglycemic shock, a severe drop in blood sugar.
These hypoglycemic deaths really started to stick out in the spring of 2018 when, number one, there was a cluster of them.
The main cause is usually medications used to treat diabetes, such as insulin. Severe hypoglycemia in non-diabetic patients is extremely rare.
In all these cases, doctors attempted to revive the patients with a dose of dextrose, essentially highly concentrated sugar. But it didn't work. Could these repeated failures be a coincidence? It didn't seem likely.
These hypoglycemic events were totally abnormal, out of the blue, and should not have occurred.
By the summer of 2018, a total of 8 veterans died of causes related to hypoglycemic shock, all at the same West Virginia Veterans Hospital, which had investigators worried that these deaths were anything but natural and might possibly be murder.
It wasn't accidental. It was not based on medication. Something was happening here, and it was happening frequently enough that it appeared to be deliberate.
In the summer of 2018, doctors at the Lewis A. Johnson Veterans Hospital in West Virginia were facing a cluster of unexplained deaths. For 8 people to die of conditions connected to hypoglycemic shock at the same hospital inside of a year was unprecedented and needed to be explained before more people died.
Could it be someone who is using the wrong needles? Could it be someone who's using the wrong type of insulin? Or, could a medication be bad?
The dead were Air Force veteran George Shaw, Army and Air Force veteran Raymond Golden, Navy veterans Russell Posey and Robert Edge Sr., and Army veterans Archie Edgell, William Holloway, Robert Kozel, and Felix McDermott. Despite the commonality of symptoms, the official causes of death varied.
The families did not request an autopsy. These were elderly patients. They all had additional medical issues. That's why they were in the hospital.
Doctors, still trying to find out how or even if these deaths were connected, and suspecting they were murders, wanted autopsies. The problem was all the victims had been buried for months. Felix McDermott's family was among the first to be contacted.
My sister called me, and I don't think I said it, but I was thinking it. Who did he piss off? Sometimes my dad does that, but, it was a shock.
And if Felix McDermott was murdered, his family had no doubt he'd want justice. And if that meant exhuming his body, they were sure he'd approve.
My dad would have wanted it. He would want to do everything he can possibly do to catch this person. He's going to tell them, do what you have to do to get this person.
So, in a rare move, Felix McDermott's body was dug up and sent to doctors from the Armed Forces Medical Examiner System at the Air Force Base in Dover, Delaware. McDermott had not fallen in the line of duty, but doctors still felt a keen responsibility to find out how he died.
What happens behind these walls is incredibly sacred, and when the bodies of these veterans were brought here, they were treated in accordance with our protocols, which is utmost respect at all times.
By the time of Felix McDermott's autopsy, he had been buried for 6 months.
This was going to be incredibly challenging because there was extensive decomposition. We were not able to get blood samples for toxicologic analysis because, there was not no suitable samples were available.
Despite the considerable challenges of performing an autopsy on an exhumed body, doctors had some good information to work with. They knew that McDermott and other veterans had been treated with dextrose after going into hypoglycemic shock. And they knew that this dextrose didn't do what it was designed to do, jumpstart the victim's blood sugar. This led to a theory that someone had injected the victims with so much insulin that their blood sugar levels could not possibly recover.
We were looking for evidence of insulin administration. Another question that we had for the investigators is, how do you think the insulin was administered?
In Felix McDermott's lower abdomen, doctors found a bruise caused by what was probably a needle puncture. This area was tested for the possibility of insulin injection.
We took a section of that area, looked at it under the microscope, and we saw features that were suspicious for an injection site. We stained it for insulin and found out that it was positive. That told me that he was injected with insulin at that location. Since Mr. McDermott was a non-diabetic who was never prescribed insulin in the hospital, that is a major red flag.
This left these medical detectives with no doubt that Felix McDermott had been murdered, which left a lot of open questions about the strange deaths of his fellow veterans, 7 of whom were also exhumed and autopsied. Could a serial killer be stalking the halls of a West Virginia veterans hospital? If so, whoever it was had done a great job of covering the trail.
There was no surveillance camera footage on the ward in the VA Medical Center. There were no eyewitnesses, there were no fingerprints, there was no DNA, there was no murder weapon.
Ground zero for the investigation into the deaths of 8 military veterans was the hospital where they all died, the Lewis A. Johnson Medical Center in Clarksburg, West Virginia.
They immediately suspect they have a serial killer who is going after patients in the local hospital, which is a terribly scary prospect. But who is it? There's over 1,200 employees at the hospital.
Post-exhumation autopsies left no doubt the murder weapon was insulin. How could this happen? The answer was shocking. An in-house investigation revealed that insulin was easy for almost anyone in this hospital, a staff member, a patient, or even a visitor, to get their hands on.
We discovered that insulin at the facility was not secure. It was out in the open, and it was not tracked.
From there, the problems for investigators got even worse. More than a year had passed since the first victim's death. Whoever did this might literally have gotten away with multiple murders.
It became clear very early on that it was very unlikely we were going to have any smoking gun. We weren't going to have a murder weapon or any physical evidence for that matter.
Once you have the medical evidence, which is that someone gave these patients insulin, of course, now you have to prove who gave these patients insulin.
Among the things all the victims had in common was that they were treated in the same ward at the Veterans Hospital, Ward 3A. And by backtracking when the symptoms began to appear with all the victims, investigators concluded the shot of insulin that sent them into hypoglycemic shock happened on the overnight shift.
There were only 4 employees in the whole hospital who had been on shift each of the days that these men had experienced this hypoglycemic event. One of those employees was on the ward where these events took place, and that was Rita Mays.
44-year-old Rita Mays was a veteran herself. She'd served in the National Guard and had been working as a nursing assistant at the VA hospital since 2015.
She was actually the 2016 recipient for the Nursing Award of Excellence at the facility, and she didn't have a criminal history.
But a background check revealed some potentially disturbing information about Rita Mays.
The investigators found that she had left her previous employment as a jail guard under suspicion of using excessive force against an inmate. So that gave a little bit of a red flag that she could be someone who can be violent.
Further checking revealed a home life in disarray. Rita's eldest son was in jail on drug charges, and her husband was also behind bars.
Rita's husband was in federal prison for child pornography, possession of child pornography, but she was standing by her husband while he was in federal prison.
Detectives had more than enough evidence for a search warrant and examined Rita's digital footprint, her web activity, text messages, and viewing habits.
What we did find was that she had watched episodes of Nurses Who Kill, and several of these episodes involve providing insulin to patients and causing their death.
Rita also complained to coworkers, sometimes about patients who later died.
The investigative team recovered messages that Rita Mays would send to coworkers in which she would complain about some of the victims in the case or indicate that she was frustrated with them.
I think she said something along the lines of, I'm going to kill this patient. I had this other patient resting, and now he's got him all riled up and they won't settle down. So ultimately, something that a lot of people say in frustration, they don't necessarily mean it.
In fact, on a couple of occasions, Rita participated in life-saving measures to save the patients. If she was a serial killer, there was no solid evidence to prove it. Investigators on the cases of 8 veterans who died under mysterious circumstances at a West Virginia VA hospital had become convinced a nurse, Rita Mays, was a serial killer.
The medical evidence was very compelling, but there were challenges in proving that Rita Mays was the person who committed these crimes, and that was because we didn't have surveillance in the hospital. So really what we were left with was a circumstantial case.
But another piece of circumstantial evidence bolstered the case against Rita Mays. There were numerous phone calls with her husband, who was in prison on child pornography charges. As part of standard prison procedure, these calls were recorded.
I had to take over sitting one of the one-on-ones, so the other aide could come out and work on the floor. And the one I was sitting with, I wanted to freaking strangle.
What?
I couldn't keep him in bed. He finally, at about 6:50, fell asleep.
He'll sleep all day. Be up all night.
Probably. Which means I'll have to deal with him again tonight.
That night, when she did go back to work and was assigned to sit with that patient, you saw a subsequent drop in the victim's blood sugar value. And ultimately, that patient died.
Because of the absence of direct evidence, what came next was something of a cat-and-mouse game between Rita and detectives.
The one prevailing theme from Rita Mays' first interview was a comment she made repeatedly to the investigative team that things were being missed. However, when she was asked to expand on this, she didn't.
I just see that I just don't see things are being missed.
Like what?
I don't know, but it's like patients will be fine, and then the next minute their sugar's low. We've had several of them, and I don't know what's being missed.
In later interviews, investigators made it clear. They told Rita they knew she killed those veterans.
It's up to you. Will you let me help you?
I don't know how you can help.
She was confronted with all the evidence. When she was asked what the prosecutors would think after looking at the evidence, she herself said, "It looks like I did this." She could just never bring herself to confess.
Please join us in fixing the system. You have a voice. You can tell us what's been going on here. You can help us.
There was one point during that interview where Rita sat back in the chair and she looked up at the ceiling. And I think she really saw everything that the investigative team had put together and that we had at that point connected the dots. And we knew her to be the one that had done this.
Ultimately, we'll never know why Rita Mays killed these defenseless people, these honorable men. But the investigation seems to tell us it had a lot to do with some hero complex, that she wants to be the one that found that these patients had a low blood sugar and that could participate in trying to save their lives.
Investigators had put together a chilling case. For reasons Rita never explained, she went on a course of premeditated murder. Alone in the room with her victims, she injected them with insulin that was readily available in the hospital. The resulting shock to the bodies of these elderly veterans was deadly. The medical staff trying to save them had no idea the person working right by their side was a serial killer.
She would insinuate herself into the life-saving procedures. Other times she would sit and cry while she held these patients' hands.
It was just difficult to imagine that somebody could do that somebody could walk around and say, oh, let's inject this one tonight, and oh, let's inject this one tomorrow night. It's just unimaginable.
Some of them could have lived another 10, 15, 20 years. And some could have just passed the next day on their own. And I hope that everyone that sees this prays for all of us, because it is a hard thing to go through.
In the summer of 2020, Rita Mays pled guilty to 7 counts of murder and 1 count of assault with intent to commit murder. She received the maximum sentence, life behind bars.
In the federal system, there is no such thing as parole. Rita Mays will spend the rest of her life in prison.
The judge called her the monster that no one saw coming.
Because of the ages of her victims and her unusual choice of murder weapon, Rita Mays almost got away with murder. The problem was that she couldn't stop killing, which ultimately created enough evidence to expose her. The hospital said what happened doesn't represent the quality health care veterans deserved, and vowed to make changes to ensure patient safety. But thanks to science and investigators' determination to get to the truth, the questions about these deaths and who was responsible have been laid to rest along with the victims.
These people were honorable men who served our country. They were fathers, they were brothers, they were grandfathers, they were even great-grandfathers. And so I refuse to focus on Rita Mays and what I think of her. I focus on these victims that we brought justice to.
Oh, there's the captain. Captain Jack.
Up next, everyone in town knew the local handyman.
He's really tough, hardworking, really look up to him.
His vicious murder makes no sense to anyone.
Somebody has to have an answer.
The motive in this case was tragic.
A crime this violent creates evidence, and some of it can't be hidden.
The jury wants to see things other than testimony. They want to see forensics.
And those forensics point to a pillar of the community.
People have been talking to him about potentially running for governor.
The town of Derry is nestled in the southern part of New Hampshire, just across the border from Massachusetts.
It's always been known as sort of a working-class town. You meet a lot of blue-collar, just really salt-of-the-earth people.
And salt of the earth was how everyone described Jack Reed. The local handyman was a fixture around town, a larger-than-life father of 5.
Hi, there's Maggie and Dad.
It was very difficult to find anyone who had any animosity towards Jack Reed.
Here's Dad with his fishing gear. He's fishing already. Look at this. Big striper.
He loved fishing, he loved cars, he loved sports, things like that.
Jack was just a hardworking, loving man, with his children especially.
When Jack didn't show up for a job in June of 2005, people who knew him immediately suspected something was wrong. His children put up flyers all over town. Days passed.
I don't know, just everything just seemed off.
I immediately called Jack's cell phone, and it went to voicemail, which I knew was not a good sign.
About a week after Jack went missing, there was a potential break over the border in Massachusetts.
They said they found Dad's truck. And I said, oh, they found him, right? And they said, just come home. And then when I got home, they both ran out and hugged me. My nana was there. She hugged me too. It was really hard.
There was a body in the back of Jack's truck, and it had undergone a savage beating. The victim's head had been crushed. There was a hole in his chest the size of a baseball. This was a clear case of overkill.
That's one of the things that prosecutors really focused on, was that this was a personal thing. This was a deeply personal murder.
Dental records were needed to confirm the victim was Jack Reed. He was 57 years old.
I was shocked. It was shocking. It felt like a movie. It was harsh.
Jack did not deserve that. Nobody deserves that, but it's just the way everything went down. My heart breaks for him.
Investigators looking for who did this faced problems straight away. In a potential setback, this was what investigators call a secondary crime scene.
It was obvious to us that where we found his body was not the murder scene.
And no one had any idea where that was. Still, there was a lot of potentially valuable evidence with the body. It was covered in thick plastic tarps and surrounded by rocks and broken tree branches.
All that material that was inside the truck would be valuable to recover and potentially down the road identify where the crime scene actually occurred.
But while analysts collected evidence, detectives and Jack Reed's family had one question they couldn't answer. Who hated a humble handyman enough to beat him to death? The truck with Jack Reed's body was found in the parking lot of a busy shopping center 40 miles from his home. The center had an old video surveillance system.
We think that having videotape could be something really helpful.
The video showed Jack's truck being dropped off the last day he was seen alive.
The surveillance from Target revealed Jack Reed's truck pulling into the parking lot, followed by a minivan. Two people got out of Jack's truck.
They then walked to the Toyota Sienna minivan and were driven away by the person behind the wheel. Was it possible to identify these men? Analysts isolated and scrubbed the images in an attempt to get better clarity, but the old tape system made it impossible.
It left us very frustrated.
Analysts now turned to the minivan in the video and faced the same problem. So they took a bold step.
We sent the video to NASA to see what they could do to enhance the video to at least identify the license plate.
But glaring sunlight in the image created too much distortion.
Just because of the way the sun was striking the license plate, was completely unable to be seen, even with NASA working to enhance it.
Still, this was hardly a total setback. Investigators now knew there were at least 3 people connected in some way to Jack's murder, and one drove a distinctive vehicle.
It was a limited Sienna minivan where there were fairly small numbers being sold in the United States.
In another piece of surveillance video, police found an unexpected clue.
Jack's daughter is actually on video at Target while he's dead in the bed of his truck.
This was a week after the murder, and at this point, Jack Reed's body had not yet been found. When questioned right after her father went missing, Megan said the last time she saw him was the night of June 27th, but that was impossible.
Her dad was deceased on the 27th.
In a mix-up that took precious time early in the investigation, this turned out to be an innocent mistake. Megan simply got her dates wrong and was ultimately alibied. The timing of her appearance at the shopping center was just an unfortunate coincidence.
Megan felt terrible that they were thinking that she had to be part of it.
Now, detectives concentrated on their primary source of evidence, Jack's truck. And in it, they found something that revealed lots of information about Jack's final days.
Jack Reed's logbook was in the cab of the truck. That logbook was used by Jack Reed to write down all of his jobs.
This logbook indicated that Jack's last known appointment, apparently with someone named Charlie, was at a specific address in the New Hampshire town of Deerfield. This was a large house, connected to an even larger horse barn. The owner, Mike Connors, said he didn't know Jack Reed and denied knowing anyone named Charlie. Detectives weren't sure what to make of this. They also weren't sure what to make of Mike Connors.
He was probably the most nervous person I've ever interviewed in my life. He was just shaking. For a person that had no involvement or a person that didn't know anything, there was no need for him to be as nervous as he was.
But being skittish around police is hardly proof of murder, and Mike Connors had a clean police record. He said detectives could look around the property, and they saw something. Some tree branches that looked familiar.
Those branches were similar, if not the same, as the branches that covered the body of Jack Reed in his truck.
Police spoke to a landscaper who kept his truck on the property.
The landscaper had told me that he was missing a large piece of plastic that was consistent with the plastic that was around the body of Jack Reed when he was discovered.
Could this be the plastic tarp that was used to wrap Jack Reed's body? At this point, it was impossible to say. Detectives had plenty of suspicions, but little solid evidence.
My cousin was a Boston police detective, and he said, Ginny, someday somebody's going to talk. Somebody will have a loose mouth, and they will give it up as to what happened to Jack.
And that prediction proved accurate. As detectives tried to backtrack Jack Reed's activities in the days before his murder, they turned to his phone records.
They saw a number of phone calls coming in from what turned out to be a throwaway cell phone.
These phones are sometimes referred to as burner phones because they are used and then discarded.
Burner phones are typically used when people don't want to be detected. You can purchase a burner phone under anybody's name, anybody's alias.
Records showed that in the days before his murder, Jack Reed got several calls from this burner phone number. Police traced this number and found it was registered to a man named Charlie Was.
I had never heard such a name before as a last name, but there are people out there named Charles Was, as odd as it sounds.
Could Charlie Was be the same Charlie that Jack had written in his logbook? The man he was supposed to meet at the New Hampshire horse barn for his last appointment? Or, as is common with burner phones, was this name, Charlie Was, an alias?
When we pulled the records to that phone, the Charlie Was phone, all the calls were made to and from Jack Reed. And there was only one other call that came in, which became very important, and that call came in from Jay Brooks, Londonderry Lake House.
Jay Brooks, his full name was John, was a well-known figure throughout New Hampshire.
John Brooks was incredibly wealthy. He was worth tens of millions of dollars, upwards of potentially $50 million.
And John Brooks knew Jack Reed. Brooks moved from New Hampshire to Las Vegas in 2003 and hired Jack Reed to help him.
John Brooks was going to become a real estate developer. He had hired Jack Reed to pack up his entire home of all his personal property into an 18-wheeler.
Was there more to this relationship? Could John Brooks have any motive to kill Jack Reed? A background check showed that he owned a gold Sienna minivan, exactly like the one in the surveillance video recorded after Jack's murder. And the horse barn, the spot where Jack Reed had his last appointment, John Brooks had a long-time connection with the barn's owner, Mike Connors.
Michael Connors was John Brooks's former chief financial officer of his company that he owned for many years in Londonderry, New Hampshire.
Enough clues were pointing to this barn for police to search it. But by this time, more than a year had passed since the murder. The first thing detectives noticed inside the barn was that it was very clean, and some of the flooring was new. If the barn was the primary crime scene, the spot where Jack Reed was killed, there would have been a lot of blood to clean up. The interior was sprayed with luminol.
Luminol is an agent that illuminates blood. Blood can be sitting for months, years, several years, and still be detected by luminol.
The cracks between the barn's floorboards began to glow, and so did some spots on the ceiling.
We were able to find significant amounts of blood and areas where blood had seeped through planks in the barn floor.
Samples of this blood were so diluted, investigators suspected the area had been bleached. The blood was sent out for DNA testing. This looked like the spot where Jack was killed. But for now, it was impossible to say for sure. Detectives investigating Jack Reed's murder soon discovered he had a contentious relationship with John Brooks.
It all really goes back to the moving job.
Numerous sources said Brooks was convinced Jack Reed had stolen some of his belongings when he helped Brooks move from New Hampshire to Las Vegas in 2003.
John Brooks became obsessed with this missing stuff. It consumed his life.
Though John Brooks lived in Las Vegas, he was seen by numerous people in New Hampshire around the time of Jack Reed's murder. TSA records revealed that when Brooks flew to New Hampshire, he flew with 2 business associates. Detectives theorized these might be the men seen in the surveillance video recorded the day Jack Reed's truck was left abandoned in Massachusetts.
That was our first lead on potential suspects.
When one of these suspects, Robin Knight, was confronted by police, he immediately told them the whole story.
That was the first time we heard a version of what happened and why to Jack Reed.
Who orchestrated this whole thing? Jay?
Well, Jay set it up to talk to the guy.
Just so there's a plan.
Well, yeah, Jay set it up.
Other co-conspirators quickly confessed and also pointed to John Brooks as the mastermind behind Jack Reed's murder.
Jay was livid at the guy for stealing his property. I understood the plan was to murder Jack Reed.
He said, would you like to make $10,000? What did you say? I said, of course I'd like to make $10,000.
John Brooks denied any involvement in the murder, and police had no physical evidence tying him to the crime or the crime scene. Confessions, while valuable, weren't nearly enough.
When you're dealing with cooperating co-defendants, no matter how credible they are, juries want permission to believe them. Scientific evidence gives jurors permission to believe somebody they might not otherwise believe.
One suspect told detectives something they didn't know. Just before the murder, John Brooks mailed a package with some very unusual contents from Vegas to New Hampshire.
They had decided that they would ship some items, including things like a taser or handcuffs, that they may be able to use during the course of confronting Jack Reed so that they could ultimately kill him.
And who went to the feds? Jay and myself.
For the return label, John Brooks used a fake name. It was Jay Bryce, and it was an address for this fictional company in Las Vegas.
We filled out the shipping label. Who filled out the label? Jay did.
The address was handwritten. a handwriting analyst compared the writing on the address portion of the package with Jay Brooks' handwriting.
That analysis proved who filled out the packing label.
Beyond a degree of scientific certainty, this was Jay Brooks' handwriting.
The blood from the horse barn finally came back with a match to Jack Reed's DNA. This, along with the luminol evidence and the confessions, left no doubt about what happened, where it happened, and who did it.
Jurors can say, okay, these co-defendants, even though they cut a deal with the state, they're telling me the truth.
Detectives believe John Brooks planned Jack Reed's murder for months, if not years. Brooks and his co-conspirators used a burner phone to make Jack think there was work for him at the isolated horse barn. Once inside, they subdued him and then beat him to death with a sledgehammer, which was never found.
I come down with the hammer like this, and I hit him on the side of the head.
Again, how many times do you hit him?
3 times, I think.
The final blow to Jack Reed was struck by John Brooks.
I had said, he won't stop bleeding. Jay picked up the hammer, hit him at least 2 times. It stopped the heart, stopped the bleeding.
In his zeal to kill Jack Reed, John Brooks made many mistakes. Driving a distinctive minivan to where the body was dumped was one. Putting his handwriting on the murder kit was another. Leaving blood behind at the crime scene, yet another. But detectives agree that what finally did him in was his sloppy handling of the burner phone used to lure Jack Reed to the murder site.
Without that phone call, there's a possibility that John Brooks would have never been arrested for this murder.
This was how John Brooks ultimately got exposed. Just days before the murder, he called the burner phone to make sure the voicemail worked. This was the same burner phone later used to lure Jack Reed to the horse barn where he was killed. When John Brooks called that number, phone records of those calls clearly linked him to the burner phone, to Jack Reed, and to the murder conspiracy.
It was less than 1 minute, but police were able to track down all of the murderers based on that one single phone call.
In the fall of 2008, John Brooks stood trial in New Hampshire's first death penalty case in 70 years. He was convicted of capital murder.
Out of the 12 jurors, 1 juror decided to exercise mercy for Jay Brooks and not sentence him to death, and so he is serving a life sentence.
Co-conspirators got sentences ranging from 15 years to life in prison. The barn owner, Mike Connors, was cleared of any involvement in the murder.
John Brooks was the mastermind behind this whole thing.
The residents of Derry, New Hampshire, still have trouble understanding this murder, and so do investigators who work the case. A hard-working family man dead. A family torn apart. A slew of lives ruined. All to get revenge over a theft that never even happened.
There was no evidence that Jack ever stole from John Brooks.
This case left us and many people wondering, why would a multimillionaire who had the world at his fingertips kill someone like Jack Reed?
I think the moral of this story is that no matter how long you plan a crime, how much money you spend on it, even one single piece of evidence can land you in jail for the rest of your life.
Xin chào tất cả các bạn, hôm nay mình sẽ kiếm chân này gấu mẹ và gấu con này.
Gấu mẹ và gấu đây chủ không tâm. Tí nữa lưng màu tí này mì tô ai quay